a $10 sign, a dog who wouldn't leave, and two men who were about to make the worst mistake of their lives. It was raining in Harbor Ridge when Grant Mercer saw her, a young woman pressed against a brick wall, her German shepherd standing between her and two men who smelled like bad decisions and easy money. The dog was old. His joints were stiff, but his eyes said something different. His eyes said, "Try me." Grant had seen that look before. In a mirror, in a desert, in another life. He stopped walking, and nothing was ever the same again. Before we go further, if you've never seen a story hit you like a freight train wrapped in a feeling you forgot you had, you're about to. Subscribe right now and hit that notification bell so you never miss what comes next. Drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I genuinely want to know how far this story travels. And if it moves you even a little, hit that like button. It costs you nothing. It means everything. Now, let's go back to Harbor Ridge. The rain came in sideways that afternoon. Not the romantic kind of rain that people describe in songs. This was the Pacific Northwest's particular brand of misery. Cold, relentless, with a wind that found every gap between your collar and your neck and settled there like a grudge. The kind of rain that made Harbor Ridge, Oregon, look like a watercolor painting someone had left outside too long. Everything bleeding into everything else. Gray sky into gray lake. Gray streets into gray faces. Grant Mercer had his head down and his hands buried in the pockets of a jacket that had been waterproof once. Maybe 3 winters ago. He was counting steps. It was a habit from the teams. A way to stay oriented in darkness or disorientation. He didn't need to count steps on Birchwood Lane. He'd walked this route 400 times. But the counting gave his mind something to do besides replay things he couldn't change. 43 steps from the corner store to the intersection. He had a paper bag in one arm. Inside it, a can of black beans, a box of instant rice, 2 packets of ramen, and a jar of store-brand peanut butter that had been marked down because the lid was slightly dented. $22 and change. That was the week's food budget after he'd paid the minimum on the electric bill. Nobody talks about how quiet disability checks are, how they arrive without ceremony, disappear into accounts that are always running dry, and leave you feeling like the government's way of saying, "We acknowledge you exist, but prefer not to think about it too hard." Grant didn't feel sorry for himself about the money. He'd grown up with less. What hollowed him out wasn't the poverty, it was the smallness. The sense that his world, which had once stretched across 3 continents and moved at the speed of a helicopter insertion, had compressed down to this, a dented peanut butter jar and 43 steps. He was at 31 when he heard it. Not a scream. Nothing that dramatic. Just a voice pitched too high and too tight. The kind of controlled fear that people use when they're trying not to escalate something that's already escalating. He'd been trained to hear that frequency. Some sounds you can't unlearn. He looked up. 20 feet ahead, in the narrow gap between a closed hardware store and a barber shop, 2 men had a young woman backed against the wall. One of them was heavyset, mid-30s, wearing a rain jacket with a logo Grant didn't recognize. The other was leaner, younger, with the particular kind of energy that comes from never having experienced real consequences. They weren't touching her, not yet, but they had positioned themselves the way predators do, blocking exit angles, filling the visual space, making the world feel smaller. The woman was maybe mid-20s, dark hair plastered wet against her face. She had a canvas backpack that had seen better decades, and beside her, sitting on a piece of cardboard that was slowly disintegrating in the rain, was a dog. Old German shepherd, 70, maybe 75 pounds. His muzzle had gone silver. His left rear hip carried the kind of subtle lean that meant arthritis or an old injury, or both. Someone had propped a cardboard sign against the wall next to him, written in marker that had run slightly in the rain, "Dog for sale, $10." Grant's legs stopped, just stopped, independent of any decision he made consciously. The dog wasn't acting like a dog for sale. He wasn't cowering. He wasn't looking around the way nervous dogs do, scanning for exits. He had positioned himself precisely between the woman and the 2 men, and he was absolutely, completely still. Weight slightly forward, ears up and rotated forward, head just below shoulder level. The combat-ready posture of an animal that had been trained. Not a pet's instinctive fear response, a professional's controlled preparation, The lean man said something Grant couldn't fully hear over the rain, but the tone was unmistakable. The kind of tone that adds, or else, to everything. The woman said quietly, "I'm not asking for trouble." "You're standing on private property," the heavy-set one said. Louder. He wanted her to feel the volume. "Every day you set up this little charity show here. You owe us. Simple math." "The city said this sidewalk is public access." "The city?" The lean one laughed. Not a real laugh. The kind of laugh that's a threat wearing a costume. "You hear that, Danny? The city." That was enough. Grant set his grocery bag down against the hardware store wall. Carefully. The beans could not afford to be dented. He rolled his neck once, felt the familiar click in his left trapezius, where a piece of shrapnel had kissed him in Helmand Province 9 years ago, and walked toward them. He didn't rush. Rushing changes the energy of an approach and puts people on alert. He'd learned that in pre-deployment training, reinforced it in a dozen operations he couldn't talk about in public. You move with purpose, not aggression. You let the stillness of your body communicate that you haven't decided anything yet, even when you have. The dog saw him first. The shepherd's eyes moved to Grant at about 15 feet out, and something happened that Grant didn't expect. The dog didn't treat him as a threat. His posture didn't shift toward warning. Instead, those amber eyes, old eyes that had seen things, fixed on Grant with something that felt uncomfortably like recognition. Grant had worked with military working dogs twice in his career. Once in 2009, a Belgian Malinois named Czar, who could clear a room faster than any human on the team. Once in 2013, a German shepherd attached to a special reconnaissance unit whose name Grant had been told but could no longer remember. He knew what trained dogs looked like. He knew what their eyes did when they assessed a person and made a decision. This dog made a decision in about 2 seconds. And then he exhaled, a long, quiet breath. And his posture shifted just slightly, just enough, like he'd been waiting for backup and it had finally arrived. Grant stopped 4 feet from the two men. "Hey," he said, flat, conversational. The heavy-set one, Danny, apparently, turned around with the slow confidence of someone who had never been in a situation that didn't resolve in his favor. He looked Grant up and down. Saw the worn jacket, the grocery bag left against the wall, the fact that Grant was alone. Made a calculation. It was the wrong one. "Take a walk, buddy," Danny said. "Thought about it," Grant said. "Decided not to." The lean one stepped forward half a step, and Grant's eyes moved to him with the kind of precise, unhurried attention that has nothing to do with aggression and everything to do with threat assessment. The lean one felt it. His half-step stopped. "You don't know what you're walking into," Danny said. "Two guys harassing a woman and her dog in the rain." Grant kept his voice exactly even. "I'm pretty caught up. She owes us. She doesn't know you." Grant looked at the woman briefly. Just a flash, enough to register her face and confirm she was okay, then back to Danny. "So whatever story you're telling yourself about what she owes you, let it go." Danny's face did something complicated. He was used to being the biggest person in low-stakes confrontations. He had a read on Grant that said veteran, probably broken, probably not actually a problem. He wasn't entirely wrong about 2 of those 3. "Last chance, man. Walk away." Grant said nothing. He just looked at Danny the way he'd learned to look at situations in the field. Not with anger, not with calculation, with absolute patience. The kind of patience that comes from having been in genuine danger and having discovered that most threats are just noise wearing a human face. The silence stretched out for about 5 seconds. 5 seconds is a long time in a confrontation. Most people can't hold it. Most people fill it with words, or movement, or backing down. Grant held it the way he held a firing position, completely still, completely present, completely committed to however long it needed to be. Danny looked at the lean one. The lean one had already taken a step back that he probably didn't consciously decide to take. "This isn't over," Danny said. To the woman, not to Grant. Then he turned and walked away, the lean one half a step ahead of him, both of them performing the particular choreography of men pretending they chose to leave. Grant watched them until they turned the corner. Old habit. You don't stop watching until the threat is out of sight. And then you give it another 10 seconds, because sometimes they circle back. He turned to the woman. She was staring at him with an expression that wasn't gratitude exactly. It was more complicated than that. Wariness mixed with relief, which is what happens when kindness arrives from strangers in places where kindness hasn't been common. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "I know." The dog was still looking at him, that same steady gaze. Grant crouched down slowly, putting himself at the dog's eye level. The respectful approach, the way you present yourself to a working animal, and held out the back of his hand. The shepherd leaned forward and touched his nose to Grant's knuckles, cold, wet nose. The kind of deliberate gesture that a trained dog makes differently from a pet. More formal, like a handshake. "He's beautiful," Grant said. "He's 11, the woman said. "His hips are going. Vet said probably another year, maybe 2. Grant straightened up. The rain was still coming down. The woman's lips had gone slightly blue at the corners from the cold. "I'm Grant." "Elena." "That your sign?" She looked at the cardboard, then back at him. Something shifted in her expression, a brief, controlled collapse, the kind that people who've been holding themselves together for too long sometimes can't prevent. "Yeah." $10. "Yeah." Grant looked at the dog again. "He doesn't look like he's for sale." Elena didn't say anything for a moment. When she spoke, her voice was very careful. "No, he doesn't." Dot. The rain had found its rhythm by the time Grant retrieved his grocery bag and made the decision that he'd think about later as either the most human thing he'd done in 3 years or the beginning of something he wasn't equipped for. Probably both. His apartment was 6 blocks from where they stood. 3 rooms. 1 window that faced a brick wall, 1 that faced the street. He'd furnished it with things that were functional and nothing more. A mattress on a low frame. A table that wobbled unless you put a folded matchbook under 1 leg. 2 chairs that didn't match. The walls were bare except for a single nail where a picture used to hang. He'd taken the picture down 8 months ago because it made some mornings harder, and he hadn't found a reason to replace it. "I can offer a floor," he said, "and whatever's in this bag." Elena looked at him the way people look at things they desperately want but have learned not to trust. "You don't know me." "You don't know me either." "That's not reassuring." "I know." He adjusted the bag on his arm. "Ranger can make the call if you want. He seems like better judgment than either of us right now." She looked at the dog. The dog looked at Grant. Then the shepherd rose. Slowly, that left hip telegraphing discomfort as he stood, and took 3 steps in the direction Grant had indicated, as if someone had given him coordinates. Elena watched this and made a sound that might have been a laugh in better circumstances. "He's done that before. Just decided for me." "Smart dog." "Yeah." She picked up the backpack. "He usually is." The walk back was mostly quiet. Grant didn't ask questions. He'd been on the other side of that enough times. Arriving somewhere after something had happened and having people need to fill the silence with inquiry when what you actually needed was for someone to just let you exist for a few minutes without having to explain yourself. Ranger walked between them. His pace was deliberate, measured. He had the gait of an animal that had learned to manage pain without showing it, which was something Grant understood at a cellular level. Inside the apartment, Grant turned on the light, a single overhead bulb that cast more shadow than illumination, and set the bag on the counter. Elena stood near the door with her backpack still on, the way people stand when they haven't decided yet whether they're staying. "Take the pack off," Grant said, not unkindly. "It's not going anywhere." She took it off, set it near the door, where she could still see it. Grant opened the beans. He had 1 pot, 1 pan, a spatula that had warped slightly from being left on a hot burner, and a collection of spices that had accumulated without any particular culinary intention. He cooked the way field medics treat wounds, efficiently, without sentiment, focused on the outcome over the aesthetics. Ranger settled near the baseboard heater. He found a position that favored his left hip, turned twice, and lowered himself with the careful deliberation of someone who has learned not to trust their body to catch them if they go down hard. "How long has he had the hip problem?" Grant asked. "Since last winter." Elena had drifted from the door toward the table. She sat in one of the mismatched chairs with her hands wrapped around each other, her wet hair dripping quietly onto the floor. "He doesn't complain." "They don't." Grant stirred the beans. "Even when they should." She looked at him. "Military?" "Was. Me too. Well, my brother was." She paused. "He's gone now." Grant set the spoon down for a moment, turned the burner slightly lower. "I'm sorry." "Yeah." She said it flat, the way people say things they've said so many times they've worn the feeling out of the syllables but haven't found different ones yet. "Me too." The dinner was basic. Beans over rice, peanut butter on crackers that Grant found at the back of a cabinet, sealed and barely in date. 2 glasses of tap water. It was the kind of meal that, in a dining facility, you'd walk past without stopping. Here, with the rain against the window and rangers breathing steady near the heater, it felt like something else. They talked. Not the kind of talking that fills silence, but the kind that happens when 2 people who haven't had real conversation in a long time suddenly find themselves in the same room without an exit strategy. Elena told him pieces. Not the whole shape of it. She wasn't ready for that. But pieces. She'd been in Harbor Ridge for 3 weeks, she said. She'd been sleeping in her car until the car stopped starting. She'd lost her housing in Portland after her savings dried up in a way she described as "it just went faster than I expected," which Grant recognized as the careful phrasing of someone who hasn't fully let themselves see the disaster from the outside. "Ranger ate before you today," Grant said. It wasn't a question. He'd noticed the dog wasn't food urgent the way a hungry animal is, while she had eaten with the controlled restraint of someone managing need. Elena didn't answer right away. Then, "He's 11. His time is different." Grant looked at his plate. "When did you eat last?" "Before tonight." A pause. "Yesterday morning," she said. "I had some crackers." He didn't respond immediately. He got up and made 2 more crackers with peanut butter and set them in front of her. She started to object, and he said, "I ate already, before I found you." He had not eaten already. The beans were the first food he'd had since the half-eaten granola bar that morning, but she didn't need to know that, and he didn't need credit for it. He gave her the mattress. He slept on the floor with a sleeping bag that he kept for emergencies, a habit from years of never knowing where you'd end up. The floor was hard. He'd slept on harder. He was asleep by 10, which was late for him. The medication he'd been prescribed after the VA evaluation knocked the sharp edges off sleep, but didn't do anything about what came with it. The nightmare that arrived sometime after midnight was not unusual. The geography of it changed, sometimes a compound in Kunar, sometimes a narrow street, sometimes a terrain that didn't exist in any country, but only in the specific logic of his sleeping brain. But the shape was always the same. He was too slow. Something was happening at a distance, and he was moving through a medium that wasn't quite air, his legs operating without his authority, his radio silent, his teammates somewhere he couldn't see. He came out of it gasping, back against the wall before he was fully conscious, already in a tactical crouch with his hand reaching for a weapon that wasn't there. The room was dark and quiet. And then Ranger was there. The dog crossed the room in the darkness without sound, without hesitation, and sat down directly in front of Grant, not touching him, not crowding him, just present, 3 feet away. And then he did something that Grant later tried and failed to describe accurately to anyone. He exhaled, long and slow. A controlled, deliberate exhalation that dropped the energy in the room by about 10 degrees. Grant stared at him. Ranger held his gaze. Grant's heart rate was at maybe 130. He could feel it in his ears, in his temples, in the particular way his hands weren't quite steady. He focused on the dog's breathing, matched it without deciding to. In for 4, out for 4. The rhythm of something trained. After 2 minutes, Grant's hands were steady. After 5, his heart rate was somewhere in the 80s. After 10, he realized that the darkness in the room was just darkness. Nothing in it. Just an apartment with rain against the window and a sleeping woman on a mattress and an old German shepherd looking at him with amber eyes in the dark, completely unbothered by whatever Grant had just come through. "Good dog," Grant said. His voice was rough and low and barely there. Ranger's tail moved twice. Then he turned, walked back to his spot near the heater, circled once with that careful economy of movement, and lay down. Grant sat with his back against the wall for a while. His breathing was even. His hands were still. Outside, the rain had dropped to a murmur against the glass. He hadn't slept through a nightmare in nearly 3 years. He hadn't had anyone, person or animal, sit with him through one. He pulled his knees up and closed his eyes and waited to see if it would come back. It didn't. When he woke up, it was 6:14 a.m. by the clock on his phone, and gray light was beginning to seep around the curtain edges, and Ranger was sitting 3 feet from him again, watching him with the patient attention of something that has nowhere else to be and no urgency about being there. Grant looked at the dog. The dog looked at Grant. Outside, the rain had stopped. For the first time in weeks, Grant didn't reach for the medication before he got up. He just got up. He walked to the kitchen window and looked out at the street. A delivery truck was making its morning rounds. A woman in a yellow raincoat was walking a small terrier who was investigating something near a storm drain with tremendous scientific commitment. The lake at the end of the street reflected a sky that was turning, gradually and without drama, from gray to something lighter. Harbor Ridge looked the same as it always did. Grant felt different in a way he couldn't name and didn't try to. He put the kettle on. Behind him he heard Elena stir on the mattress, heard the soft sound of her sitting up, heard her say quietly, in the tone people use when they're still half asleep and their guard is down, "Ranger?" The dog rose from his spot near the wall and walked to her. She put her arms around his neck. Grant kept his back to them and watched the kettle. He was already thinking about what they needed. Proper food, dry clothes, somewhere for her to be other than a sleeping bag floor. He was thinking about it the way he used to think about mission planning. Not emotionally, but logistically, because logistics is what gets people through. He didn't examine why he was thinking about it. He'd learned a long time ago that the why of the things that pull you forward is usually less important than the fact that something finally is. He found the coffee. It was a generic brand that tasted like ambition with no follow-through, but it was hot, and it was there. He poured 2 cups. And then, as he was carrying them to the table, he stopped. On the floor near Elena's backpack, the contents of a small side pocket had spilled slightly when she'd set it down the night before. A travel toothbrush, a folded bandana, a charging cable, and a photograph. The laminated kind that people keep with them because they can't afford to lose it to water or time. Grant wouldn't have looked, except that the photograph had fallen face up, and the figure in it was wearing a uniform he recognized. And there was a dog beside him. A younger dog, but the same coloring, the same precise posture. Grant crouched down slowly, set the coffee cups on the floor, picked up the photograph. The man in it was maybe 22, 23. Proud. The kind of young that doesn't know yet what it's going to cost. He was looking at the camera with a smile that belonged to someone who hadn't learned to manage his expressions yet. Completely unguarded, completely real. And beside him, sitting with that same formal attention Grant had seen in the alley yesterday, was Ranger. Grant stared at the photograph. Something moved through his chest like a current. Not an emotion he could name easily, more like a shift in gravity. He turned the photograph over. Written in pen on the back, in the careful print of someone who wanted to be sure it was legible. Lucas and Ranger, Fort Benning, K9. Training, June 2015. The name hit him like a physical thing, Lucas. He set the photograph down very carefully and straightened up and stood there for a moment, not moving, not speaking. Behind him, Elena said, "That's my brother." Grant's voice, when he found it, was very controlled. "Lucas Brooks." The silence that followed was long enough that Grant finally turned around. Elena was sitting on the mattress with Ranger beside her, and she was looking at Grant with an expression he couldn't categorize at first. Something between hope and the practiced bracing of someone who knows that when things feel like they might be significant, they usually cost something first. "You knew him," she said. It wasn't really a question. "I'm not sure yet," Grant said, which was true, and also wasn't true. because his mind was already moving backward through years to a training exercise at Fort Benning in the summer of 2015, and a young handler who had a gift for calming stressed animals that nobody else on the rotation could explain, and a name that he had filed away without knowing why. Grant said, "I need to check something." He went to the closet. The boxes were at the back, under a rain jacket and a duffel that he hadn't opened since he moved here. He hadn't opened the boxes either. There were 4 of them, and 2 of them contained things he'd been specifically not looking at for 3 years, and he'd always told himself that was fine. He pulled the first box out, opened it. Photographs, field manuals, a folded flag that he moved past quickly, unit challenge coins from 4 different deployments, his DD-214, a cracked phone case that he couldn't remember the reason for keeping. Second box, more photographs. Training documentation. A logbook from a pre-deployment exercise cycle in 2015 Fort Benning. He opened it. His own handwriting from 11 years ago was strange to look at. More confident than he felt now, the handwriting of someone who hadn't yet learned everything that would eventually teach him to be more careful. He flipped through the pages, found the entry for June 14, 2015, K9 integration exercise. 6 handlers rotating through. 1 standout, Brooks L. Unusual calm management with stressed animals. Could transfer to hostage/civilian extraction protocols. Worth noting for future mission planning. Grant read the entry twice. He sat down on the floor of his closet. He and Lucas Brooks had never served together. They'd crossed paths for 3 days in a training rotation 11 years ago, and Grant had noted him in a logbook and never thought of him again. And then Lucas had died somewhere, sometime, in a way that Grant didn't yet know, and his dog had somehow ended up here, in the rain in Harbor Ridge, with a $10 sign and a sister who hadn't eaten since yesterday. Grant sat with this for a moment. Then he got up. He carried the logbook into the living room. He set it on the table next to the coffee cups he'd never delivered. He didn't say anything yet. He didn't know what to say that wouldn't make the next thing worse before it could get better. Elena was looking at him. "When did Lucas pass?" Grant asked. 18 months ago. Her voice was careful. Exact. IED, outside of Mosul. Grant nodded. He looked at Ranger. The dog was watching him with those amber eyes, still and certain, the way he'd been from the moment Grant had walked into the alley. "He sent Ranger home when he deployed," Elena said. "Said he needed someone to look after me." She paused. "He always got that backwards." Grant picked up the logbook, turned it to June 14th, walked over and held it out to her. She took it, read the entry, read it again. Her expression didn't collapse. People with real grief don't collapse at small things. They've built walls that only specific things can breach. And a name in a logbook from 11 years ago was something complicated, something that required processing. She just sat with it for a while, holding the logbook, and Ranger pressed his head against her knee, and Grant went back to the kitchen and poured the cold coffee down the drain and started fresh. He was 3 cups in when he heard the knock. 3 knocks. Deliberate, spaced. Ranger's head came up instantly. His ears rotated forward. His body went from relaxed to still in a way that Grant felt in his spine before his conscious mind fully registered it. Not the mail carrier. Not a neighbor's mistake. The dog would have flagged it differently. Grant set his cup down, looked at Elena. She was already watching the door with the focused attention of someone who had learned, recently and painfully, that unexpected knocks were never good news. "How many people know you're here?" Grant asked. "No one," she said quietly. "I haven't told anyone." Ranger rose to his feet, standing between the door and Elena with his weight forward and his gaze locked on the handle, and the low sound he made, barely audible, more vibration than sound, contained a professional's assessment that Grant trusted completely. 3 more knocks, then a voice, muffled but identifiable as male, and recognizable in the particular way that voices you've heard recently once in anger can be when you hear them again somewhere they shouldn't be. "We know she's in there." Grant looked at Ranger. Ranger looked at the door. The dog's muscles were coiled and perfectly still. and Grant had exactly 2 seconds to make a decision that the next several minutes were going to be built on. Grant didn't move toward the door. That was the first decision. You don't move toward an unknown threat without information, and right now the only information he had was a voice he'd heard once before, in a wet alley, attached to a man who hadn't expected to be wrong about his read on Grant Mercer and was apparently still working through that. The second decision was Ranger. The dog was already positioned, weight forward, head low, ears locked, in a way that told Grant the threat wasn't singular. Ranger wasn't just watching the door. His nose was working, and his attention kept fracturing left, toward the window that faced the street, then back to the door. 2 points, which meant at minimum 2 people positioned to cover both exits. Amateur hour, Grant thought, but amateurs still got people hurt. He crossed to Elena in 3 quiet steps, crouched to her eye level, and kept his voice barely above a breath. Back wall, take Ranger. She didn't argue. She'd read the room the same way he had, not with training, but with the specific alertness of someone who'd been in enough bad situations to recognize when one was assembling itself around her again. She moved to the far wall, back corner, and Ranger went with her without being told, pressing his body against her leg and angling himself so he could still see the door. Grant went to the kitchen. He had a utility drawer. Everyone has a utility drawer, the archaeological site of small necessities. And in the back of it, behind a coil of paracord and 2 dead batteries, was a fixed blade knife in a nylon sheath that he'd kept since his last deployment and never found a reason to get rid of. He didn't take it out. He just knew where it was, which was different from needing it, and the distinction mattered. He moved to the wall beside the door. Not in front of it. Beside it, which was where you stood when you didn't know what was on the other side and preferred not to find out via whatever came through the wood. I said, we know she's in there, Danny's voice again. Louder this time, pitched for performance rather than communication. The voice of someone who wanted the neighbors to hear nothing alarming. Just a man at a door, totally reasonable, nothing to call about. Just want to talk. Grant's phone was on the counter. He could see it from where he stood. 6 feet away, which was too far to reach without crossing the door's visual line if someone looked through the peephole from the outside. He said nothing. Silence was information. Silence said, we're not panicking, we're not negotiating, and we're not moving in a way that tells you what we're doing. He heard movement outside. A shuffle of weight, shoes on concrete. 2 sets. Danny and the lean one, whose name Grant still didn't have, positioned on either side of the door's center line based on the acoustics. He'd been in enough stack formations to hear the difference between 1 person and 2. Then a third sound. Farther back. A third position, near the stairwell at the end of the hall. 3. He revised the amateur assessment upward slightly. 3 points of coverage for 1 apartment door was more thought out than he'd given them credit for. Still not good. The angles were wrong for an actual breach, and the third position at the stairwell was too far back to be useful in the first 30 seconds. But it suggested someone had at least thought about this more than Danny's impulse control usually implied. Someone had told them to come here, someone who knew Elena was in this building. That was a different problem than 2 harassers from an alley. That was organization. That was resource. Last time, Danny said through the door. His performance voice had dropped. What replaced it was quieter and less interested in the neighbors. Open the door, or we're going to have a situation. Grant looked at Elena across the room. She had her phone in her hand, screen dark so it didn't throw light, thumb hovering over the emergency call. He gave her a single nod, small, deliberate. Not yet, but be ready. He cleared his throat. Gonna need you to clarify something, Grant said, keeping his voice easy, almost bored. When you say situation, you mean the kind where I call Harbor Ridge PD and you 3 explain to a dispatcher why you're at someone's door at, he glanced at the clock, 23:14 on a Tuesday? Because I've got them on speed dial and nothing better to do. Silence on the other side. He'd given them 2 pieces of information. He knew there were 3 of them, and he knew the time, which meant he'd been tracking. People who are afraid don't track. People who've been in worse don't panic. The first piece would rattle them because it meant the apartment wasn't blind to them. The second was smaller, but mattered. It said, I'm calm, I'm counting, I'm not going anywhere. He heard low voices on the other side of the door. Consultation. Which was good. Consulting meant hesitation. Hesitation meant the original plan had assumed a faster resolution. Danny said, "You're making a mistake." "Probably," Grant said. "Usually do. Door stays closed." More consultation. Grant used the 12 seconds it bought him to look around the apartment with the specific inventory of someone assessing resources. One exit besides the door. The window that faced the street, second floor, about a 14-foot drop to the sidewalk. Manageable, but not ideal with a woman and an elderly dog with arthritic hips. His phone on the counter. The knife in the drawer. A fire extinguisher mounted by the kitchen entrance that his landlord had installed as an afterthought, and that Grant had noted on move-in day, because he noted things like that. He mapped the order of what he'd need if the door came in anyway. Not because he thought it would. The math was wrong for that. 3 people in a public apartment hallway, and a neighbor 2 doors down who went to bed at 10 and was a light sleeper based on the number of times he'd knocked on Grant's wall. But because you mapped it anyway. You always mapped it. The mission that didn't go sideways was just a mission you hadn't finished yet. The voices outside stopped. Footsteps. Moving away. All 3 sets in the direction of the stairwell. Grant stayed beside the door for another 90 seconds. Then he moved to the window, flattened himself to the wall beside it, and angled his view down to the street without putting himself in the frame. He saw Danny and the lean one emerge from the building entrance and walk toward a dark blue SUV parked half a block down. The third person, heavy-set, different build from both of them, someone Grant hadn't seen before, came out 30 seconds later and got into the passenger seat without looking up at the building. The SUV sat there for a long moment with its engine on. Then it pulled out and turned right at the intersection, disappearing from the block. Grant stayed at the window for another 3 minutes. Then he said without turning, "They're gone." He heard Elena exhale behind him. The kind of exhale that happens when a body releases something it's been clenching since before the person consciously decided to clench it. He turned around. She was still in the back corner, Ranger still pressed against her, but her posture had opened slightly, shoulders dropping from somewhere near her ears back to where they belonged. "Who was the third one?" she said. "Didn't recognize him? Did you get a look?" "Just the back of his head through the window." She lowered her phone. The emergency call icon was still open on the screen. "They knew where I was." "Yeah." "How?" Grant crossed back to the kitchen and put the kettle on again. His hands were steady. That was something he noticed without pride. It was just information about where he was. "Probably not how you think. You parked anywhere near here before the car stopped starting?" She thought about it. 2 blocks over, Roslyn Street. "How long?" "A week, maybe a week and a half." "Long enough for someone to note the plates. Run them." He leaned against the counter. "These guys aren't just freelance harassment. Someone's running them. They came here with 3 people in a vehicle after one altercation in an alley. That's not impulsive. That's directed." Elena looked at him. "Directed by who?" "That," Grant said, "is the question I'd like to answer before they come back with better planning." Ranger had moved from the back wall to the center of the room and was watching the door with a quiet persistence that Grant found both reassuring and concerning. The dog's assessment hadn't changed. He wasn't relaxed. He was at rest, which was different. Elena crossed to the table and sat down. She pulled her backpack onto her lap, unzipped the main compartment, and began carefully withdrawing items from the bottom of it. Not carelessly, but with the deliberate excavation of someone retrieving things she hadn't been able to look at in a while. A manila envelope worn at the edges. A folded paper that had been opened and refolded so many times the creases had turned soft. A USB drive on a keychain attached to a small metal carabiner. She set them on the table. Grant looked at the pile, then at her. "Lucas sent me things," she said. "Before he deployed, he said if anything happened to the house..." She stopped. Reset. "Our mother passed 2 years ago. She left us the lake house. It was all she had." She pressed the envelope flat on the table with her palm. 3 months after Lucas died, I started getting letters. Property company, saying there were title irregularities. Then saying I owed fees I'd never heard of. Then saying that if I didn't respond within a certain window, the property would be subject to transfer proceedings. Grant sat down across from her. "Show me," he said. She opened the envelope. Inside it was a series of documents: letters on company letterhead, photocopied legal filings, 2 pages from what appeared to be a county property record with annotations in the margins in different handwriting. Lucas's handwriting, Grant noted, compared against the photograph label he'd already seen tonight. Neat, careful print. The handwriting of someone who had learned to write in ways that would be readable under poor lighting and stress. Grant read the top letter first. The company name was Harrow Pacific Property Group, LLC. The letterhead was professional, too professional for what the content described, which was a series of escalating claims about unpaid maintenance assessments on the lake house that Elena's mother had apparently never registered with any documentation Elena had ever seen. "Did your mother talk about a property management company?" "No, she paid property taxes. That was it. The house has been in the family since the 70s. "Any mortgage?" "Paid off in 2009. Grant read the second letter, then the county filing, which was dense with legal language that he parsed slowly and carefully, the way he'd once read intelligence reports. Not for the first impression, but for what was underneath it, the thing the language was working to obscure. "This filing," he said, and pointed at the second page, "references an assessment lien from 2019. You said your mother was alive in 2020. "She was." "Did she ever see this?" "No, or I don't think so. She wasn't well at the end. Dementia." Elena's voice didn't change on the word, but her jaw tightened. If someone sent her something in that period, she might not have understood it or responded. Grant put the page down. "Which is when someone would make a move like this. Assessment lien during a period when the owner is documented as cognitively impaired. Quiet. Hard to challenge after the fact." "Is that legal?" "It's legal enough to be dangerous and wrong enough to be fraud, depending on how good the documentation is." He looked at the USB drive. "What's on that?" Lucas put it together. "I don't know everything on it. I haven't been able to bring myself to—" She paused. Her hand moved to Ranger, who had settled beside her chair. "I've been carrying it for 6 months, and I haven't opened it." Grant looked at her. He didn't say anything about that. He understood it precisely. The thing you know is probably important, possibly the thing that changes everything, and you cannot open it yet because opening it makes the loss of the person who made it more real than you can currently absorb. He had a box in his closet for the same reason. "We'll open it when you're ready," he said. "But I think it matters." "Yeah." She looked at the drive. "I know it does." He collected the documents and restacked them in the envelope. Then he sat back and looked at the ceiling for a moment, doing the kind of thinking that he did best when his hands were still, not analytical exactly, more like letting pieces find their own weight and arrangement rather than forcing them. 3 men dispatched to a specific address within hours of a public altercation. A property company running what appeared to be a targeted fraud against a grieving family's estate. A sister who'd lost her brother, her housing, and was down to a backpack and a $10 dog. And somewhere in all of it, Ranger, a trained military working dog who had come home from one soldier and then sat in the rain with a sign that Grant now understood wasn't a sale at all. It was a distress signal, the only one Elena had left. He said, "Tell me about the lake house." She described it the way people describe places that formed them, in pieces and sensory detail, without the kind of overview you'd give a stranger. The porch facing the water, the screen door that had never quite latched right, the smell of pine in the morning, and the specific quality of light in the late afternoon when it came through the western windows and made everything amber. Her mother's garden along the south fence, which Elena couldn't have named the plants of but could draw the shape of from memory. Lucas's handprints in the concrete of the back step, made when he was 7, slightly too deep because he'd pressed hard on purpose, wanting to make sure it lasted. Grant listened. He was good at listening. It was one of the few things from his operational career that translated cleanly into civilian life. The ability to be fully present for information delivery without interrupting or projecting or preparing his response while the other person was still talking. Most people had no idea how rare that was until they experienced it. By the time she finished, it was past 1 in the morning. The apartment was quiet enough to hear the heater cycling. Ranger had fallen asleep beside Elena's chair, breathing in the measured rhythm of an animal, finally warm. Elena said, "I don't understand why they're doing this. It's one house. It's not even... She shook her head. It's not worth that much. Waterfront property in Harbor Ridge, Grant said. What's the lake access like? Direct, small dock, about 40 meters of private shoreline. Commercial developers are buying up lakefront parcels in this county. He'd seen it, the bulletin boards at the grocery store, the local paper that he occasionally read for lack of anything better, the slow transformation of the waterfront from working-class neighborhood to something that would eventually be unrecognizable. Single residential lots with direct water access in areas they can aggregate are worth significant margin over assessed value, especially if they can acquire them under assessed value through legal mechanisms that bypass normal sale processes. Elena stared at him. So they're stealing it. They're using legal instruments to steal it, which is actually harder to stop than someone just taking something. She was quiet for a moment. Lucas knew. Seems like it. He sent me those documents before he deployed. That was 8 months before he died. She looked at the envelope. He knew, and he couldn't come home to do anything about it, and he couldn't tell me enough over secure comms to explain what to do, so he just... Her voice compressed. He just sent it all and hoped I'd figure it out. Grant said, You did. I didn't do anything. I've been living in a car with a dog. You kept the documents. You kept the drive. You didn't sign anything they sent you, did you? No, I stopped opening the letters. That was right. Don't sign, don't acknowledge, don't engage on their terms. He leaned forward. You didn't do nothing, Elena. You held the line. That matters. She looked at him in the way that people do when someone says the exact thing they needed to hear in a way that doesn't feel performed. She didn't thank him. She just absorbed it, which was more honest. Ranger made a small sound in his sleep, not distress, just the sound dogs make when they're dreaming something uncomplicated. And both of them looked at him, and there was a moment of shared quiet that wasn't uncomfortable, which was remarkable given everything around it. I should let you sleep, Elena said. In a minute. Grant got up and went back to the window, checked the street. The SUV was gone, no new vehicles that stood out. The delivery truck from that morning replaced by nothing. Harbor Ridge at 1 a.m. was mostly still. He went back to the closet and retrieved the logbook, sat down at the table and opened it to June 2015 again, and then kept reading, not looking for Lucas specifically, but reading forward through the month the way you read forward through anything when you know there's something in it you haven't found yet. He found it on June 19th, a different entry, shorter. Brooks asked about the long-term placement protocol for MWD handlers rotating out of active units. Seems personal. Check in. Grant stared at that. He hadn't checked in. He'd been pulled to a planning cycle for a rotation in the Horn of Africa, and the note had fallen out of mind the way operational notes did when the next thing arrived before you'd finished the last one. It was a small failure, the kind you didn't count at the time and found later in different ways. He closed the logbook. Outside, something moved on the street. Ranger's head came up from his sleep instantly. Not the slow surfacing of a dog disturbed by random noise, but the immediate full attention of something that had been alert even while its eyes were closed. Grant was at the window in 4 steps. The SUV was back. Different parking spot. Across the street now, nosed in at an angle that gave it a sightline to the building entrance. Engine off this time. No movement that Grant could see inside it, but the parking lights were on, which meant running power, which meant occupants. Waiting. Grant stayed at the window long enough to confirm the position and count what he could. 2 visible silhouettes in the front, possibly a third in the back seat, harder to tell with the available light. He was doing the math when Elena appeared beside him. He hadn't heard her cross the room. She looked at the SUV, said nothing. Then she pulled out her phone and opened the camera app, and before Grant could process what she was doing, photographed the vehicle through the window. Angle, positioning, license plate visible in the low street light. 3 shots. Deliberate. Evidence? She said quietly. Lucas always said document everything. Grant looked at her, then back at the SUV. Then at Ranger, who had positioned himself between them and the window with a patience that suggested he'd been in surveillance situations before and had opinions about the optimal response. Smart, Grant said. He was smarter. She lowered the phone. I'm just trying to catch up. They stood at the window in the dark, watching a vehicle watch their building, and neither of them spoke. And the silence between them was the kind that accumulates around shared understanding rather than emptiness. The particular quiet of two people who have each spent too long being the only person in the room and are only now, imperfectly and without ceremony, beginning to recalibrate. Ranger pressed against Grant's leg. Grant looked down. The dog looked up. In the amber wash of the streetlight coming through the curtain edge, with the SUV sitting patient and deliberate across the road and the clock reading 1:47 a.m. and the documents on the table spelling out a fraud that had been running for years against a family that couldn't afford the fight, Grant felt something he hadn't felt in long enough that it took him a moment to name it. Not anger, not calculation, purpose. Clean and specific and orienting in the way that only a clear target can orient someone who has been drifting so long they'd forgotten what forward felt like. He memorized the SUV's plate number from Elena's phone screen. Oregon registration. He'd run it in the morning through the DMV search tool available to the county property record system, which he'd once accessed for a neighbor's boundary dispute and still had the login for. He moved away from the window. Get some sleep, he said. Tomorrow, we start making a problem for them. Elena turned from the window. Her expression in the low light was something between exhausted and resolved. The face of someone who has finally found the specific kind of support that doesn't ask her to be smaller than the situation she's in. You don't have to do this. I know. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she nodded once, the way soldiers nod when they've received orders they actually trust, and went back to the mattress. Grant took his position on the floor. Ranger settled between them, equidistant, as if he had calculated the geometry of it and found this arrangement optimal, which, Grant thought, he probably had. The SUV sat outside for another hour and 40 minutes before it left. Grant knew because he didn't sleep. He lay on the floor with his eyes closed and his attention on the ambient sounds of the street below, cataloging engine noise and footsteps and the specific quality of 3 a.m. quiet that tells you the threat has moved on, at least for tonight. When he was certain, he finally let himself rest. Outside, Harbor Ridge was still. The lake at the end of the street lay flat and dark and gave nothing away. Inside the apartment, 3 people breathed in the dark, 2 of them sleeping, one of them doing what he'd spent most of his adult life doing, which was staying awake so someone else could rest. It was the first thing in 3 years that had felt exactly like what he was built for. The morning arrived without ceremony. Gray light pushed through the curtain edges the way it always did in Harbor Ridge in late October. Not dramatic, not gradual, just suddenly there, like the night had made a quiet administrative decision to end. Grant was already up. He'd been up since 5, sitting at the table with the documents from Elena's envelope spread in front of him and a legal pad he'd found in the utility drawer, making notes in the cramped shorthand he'd developed over years of writing things down in conditions where space and time were both limited. He'd filled 3 pages by the time Elena stirred. She sat up slowly, the way people do when they've slept harder than they intended. The sleep of bodies that had been running on insufficient everything for too long and finally cashed in. She looked at the table, at Grant, at the documents, then at the window, where the light told her something about the hour. How long have you been up? She said. A while. She sat with that for a moment. Did you sleep at all? Some. He hadn't, but he'd rested, which for him was close enough to function on. He got up and put the kettle on. Ranger was already awake. Grant suspected the dog had been awake for hours, operating on the lighter sleep cycle of an animal that had spent years treating rest as a tactical condition rather than a biological one. He was at the door, not scratching, not making noise, just sitting with the particular patience of something that understands the sequence of how mornings work and is willing to wait for it. I'll take him, Elena said, already pulling her shoes on. Check the street first, Grant said. He said it the way he said most things, even without inflection, and handed her his phone with the camera app open. SUV's been gone since around 3:30, but... She understood the but. She went to the window first, looked for 30 seconds, then... Clear. Stay on the main block, don't go past the hardware store. She looked at him the way people look at instructions they find both reasonable and slightly intrusive. I know how to walk a dog. I know you do. I'm asking you to walk him somewhere I can see if I need to. She held the look for another second, then nodded once and clipped Ranger's leash and went out. Grant listened to her footsteps on the stairs, light, controlled, and moved to the window to monitor the street below. Elena and Ranger appeared on the sidewalk. She walked him along the block, Ranger moving with his deliberate economy, pausing to investigate a patch of wet concrete near the barber shop with the focused attention of an animal reading environmental data. Nobody followed them. No vehicle moved. Grant watched for 6 minutes until they came back through the building entrance. He exhaled through his nose and went back to the legal pad. By the time Elena and Ranger were back upstairs and Elena had eaten, oatmeal that Grant made from a packet he'd found at the back of the pantry, a staple he'd been saving without knowing what for, they had a working order for the morning. The USB drive first. Elena held it on the table between them for a moment before plugging it into Grant's laptop, which was a 3-year-old machine that ran slowly but ran. She held it the way you hold something you've been not doing for a long time, with the weight of all the not doing in your hands. And then she set it down, and she plugged it in, and she looked away at the wall while the computer processed the connection. Grant looked at the screen. The drive had 12 folders and 43 individual files. Lucas had organized it with the same careful print he used for everything. Folder labels that were precise and sequential, the way someone organizes information who knows they might not be there to explain it in person. Grant recognized the thinking. He'd made similar documents before deployments, the kind you hope nobody ever needs to open. He opened the first folder, dated 8 months before Lucas deployed. Inside, photographs, not personal ones. These were documentation photos, the kind you take with deliberate framing to capture specific information. Property survey stakes, fence lines, a dock with a small placard that showed a code number, close-ups of mailbox contents, letters from Harrow Pacific Property Group, photographed page by page, still sealed in some cases with the envelope clearly in frame. Lucas had been documenting this before he left. He'd known, not just suspected, known in the specific way that people who have been trained to assess threats and document them for future use know things. He'd built a case file. Grant opened the second folder, Corporate Records, Oregon Secretary of State Business Registry printouts, photographed, Harrow Pacific Property Group, LLC, registered 2017, primary registered agent listed as a law firm in Portland, Stelner and Voigt, LLP. 2 managing members listed, both using the same P.O. box address. Grant wrote down both names on the legal pad without comment. Third folder, County Property Records, the Lake House parcel with its legal description and tax map number. Assessment history going back to 2008. Everything consistent with a single-family residential lot maintained by its private owner until 2019, where an annotation appeared in the record that hadn't been there in any prior year. A notation of an unpaid maintenance lien filed by an entity called Cascadia Waterfront Management Services. Grant looked up. You ever heard of Cascadia Waterfront Management Services? Elena, who had moved around behind him to look at the screen, said, No. Different name from Harrow Pacific. Related? That's what I'd like to know. He went back to the Secretary of State records in the second folder and cross-referenced. Cascadia Waterfront Management Services, registered 2018, 1 year after Harrow Pacific. Primary registered agent, Stelner and Voigt, LLT, same law firm, same P.O. box for the managing members, same people. 2 corporate shells layered over each other, filing claims against properties through one entity while the other remained clean for acquisitions. Grant wrote this on the legal pad and drew a connecting line between the 2 names. Elena watched him. How do you know how to read this? Intel work. Structure of it's the same. Multiple entities, shared infrastructure, obscured ownership. You're looking for the thread that connects them back to a single decision maker. He tapped the legal pad. This is what Lucas was building. He found the thread. Can we use it? Depends what else is in here. He kept opening folders. Lucas had also photographed a letter. Not to Elena, not to their mother. To himself, addressed to his barracks mailbox at Fort Benning, from Stelner and Voigt. The language was formal and nonspecific in the way that legal correspondence is when it's designed to be unprovable later, but the message was clear. The family property had been identified as part of a development aggregation initiative, and the firm wished to communicate directly with the property heir to discuss a voluntary transfer arrangement. Lucas had received this letter 6 weeks before he deployed. He had never responded. Instead, he'd spent 6 weeks building the folder structure on this drive. Elena made a small sound, not a word, just a compression of breath. And Grant didn't turn around. He gave her the moment. Ranger moved from his spot by the heater and pressed against her leg without being asked, which was the thing the dog did when the room's emotional register shifted, some frequency Grant couldn't hear, but Ranger could. "He knew he might not come back," Elena said. It wasn't a question, so Grant didn't treat it like one. He opened the last folder. Inside it was a single document, a text file, Lucas's name in the metadata, created 4 days before he deployed. Grant opened it and read it in full before he said anything. It was a summary. 2 pages. Lucas had written it in the same compact shorthand of someone trained to convey maximum information with minimum words. He'd outlined the corporate structure, the lien mechanism, the development company he believed was ultimately behind it, a real estate group called Meridian Cascade Holdings, based in Portland, with investments in several lakefront communities along the Oregon coast. He'd noted the names of 2 county officials who appeared in property records with unusual frequency during Harrow Pacific's active filing periods. He'd included the contact information for an Oregon State Attorney General's property fraud division that he'd looked up but apparently never called. At the bottom of the document, he'd written a single line that wasn't analysis. "Elena, if you're reading this, I'm sorry I couldn't be there to hand you this in person. Don't sign anything. Find someone you trust. I left Ranger for a reason." Grant closed the laptop. He sat for a moment with his hands flat on the table. Then he turned in his chair to face Elena. She had her back against the wall now, Ranger at her feet, and her face was the particular blankness of someone who is not going to cry because they have made a specific decision not to and are spending considerable resources on maintaining that decision. "He was thorough," Grant said. "He always was." Her voice came out even. "Careful. Everything we need is in here. Corporate structure, filing history, the connection between the 2 entities, the law firm running both of them, the development company behind it." Grant paused. "This is a case, a real one, not just evidence, a case someone with the right authority can actually pursue. The Attorney General's office. That's the right starting point, but I want to go one step first." He picked up the legal pad. "The County Property Records Office opens at 8:30. I want to pull the full filing history on the lien in person, with a date stamp, before anything else moves." "Why before?" "Because the SUV came back last night, which means they know we have something, or they think we might. If they have access to anyone in county records, a record pull might flag." He set the pad down. "So we pull it this morning, before they realize we're moving." Elena looked at him. "This is what you used to do. Pieces of it. Intel. Threat assessment." "Yeah." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "Why are you doing this? You could have walked past that alley." Grant looked at the table, at the legal pad with the 2 company names connected by a line he'd drawn in pencil. He thought about several answers that were true and not quite right, then settled on the one that was both. "Because Lucas logged it," he said, "and I didn't follow up. 8 years ago, he was 23 and he'd found something that mattered, and he needed someone to check in, and I didn't." He picked up the pencil and turned it in his fingers. "I don't know if it would have changed anything. Probably wouldn't have. But it's the debt I can do something about now." Elena held his gaze for a long moment. "That's not why you stopped in the alley," she said. "No." "What was?" He thought about Ranger in the rain, the posture, the eyes, the quality of stillness that he'd recognized from some frequency below conscious thought. "Your dog," he said. Elena looked down at Ranger. The shepherd had his chin resting on his forepaws, watching both of them with amber patience. "Yeah," she said quietly. "He does that." The County Property Records Office was on the third floor of the Harbor Ridge Municipal Building, a building that had been designed in the 1970s with the aesthetic sensibility of an institution that expected to be functional rather than visited, and had succeeded on exactly one of those fronts. Fluorescent lighting, linoleum floors in a color that might once have been called cream, a wall of metal filing cabinets that shared space with a row of desktop computers that were not quite old enough to be retro and not quite new enough to be reliable. Grant left Elena and Ranger at a coffee shop 3 blocks away with instructions to stay visible, stay inside, and text him every 15 minutes. She'd accepted this without argument, which told him she understood the logic even if she didn't like the implication behind it. He arrived at the records office at 8:37, 7 minutes after opening. There was one person ahead of him, a contractor type pulling building permits, and one clerk behind the counter, a woman in her mid-50s who wore reading glasses on a chain and who moved through her computer with the particular efficiency of someone who has been doing the same job for 20-plus years and has strong feelings about people who don't fill out forms correctly. Grant filled out the request form correctly. He requested the full filing history on the parcel number for the lake house, the one from Lucas's files, going back to 2015, with all associated lien records, transfer filings, and correspondence to the property owner. The clerk looked at the form, then at him, then back at the form in the way that county employees sometimes look at people who request specific and comprehensive information rather than the surface-level lookup most people do. "This is a full history pull," she said. "Takes about 20 minutes. "That's fine." She looked at him once more. The glasses chain assessment, the brief triangulation of who are you and why do you want this, and then she turned to her computer and began the pull. Grant sat down in a plastic chair against the wall and checked his phone. Text from Elena. "Coffee is terrible. Ranger is better company than the barista." That was her humor surfacing, which was a good sign. He typed back, 20 minutes, stay put. He looked at the room. 3 other people had come in behind him, all routine. Nobody who looked wrong. The contractor at the counter had gotten his permits and left. The fluorescent overhead light hummed at a frequency that had probably given the clerk a low-grade headache every working day for the past decade. His phone buzzed. Not Elena. Unknown number. He looked at it for a moment, then answered. "Mr. Mercer." Male voice. Smooth. The voice of someone who had practiced sounding reasonable for professional reasons. "My name is Warren Stelner. I represent Harrow Pacific Property Group." Grant said nothing for 3 seconds. He was counting the fact that they had his phone number, which he had not given anyone, and the number of ways to have gotten it from a license plate or a building address, and the timeline that implied. Someone moving faster and with more resources than 3 guys in an SUV. "How'd you get this number?" he said. "We're a fairly resourceful firm." A pause, calibrated for effect. "I understand you've recently become involved in a property matter that's outside your area of expertise. I want to assure you that this is a straightforward legal proceeding and the best outcome for everyone, including Ms. Brooks, is a clean resolution." "Clean resolution," Grant said. "Meaning?" "Meaning that the transfer process has been underway for some time, and any attempt to complicate it through third-party interference will only extend a difficult situation for a woman who has clearly been through enough." Grant noted the phrase third-party interference, which was specific. It meant they'd already assessed his position as external, which meant they didn't know what he had yet, which meant the drive was still a surprise. "Tell me something," Grant said. "The lien Cascadia Waterfront Management filed in 2019. What services did they actually render to the property?" Silence. Brief. "But there." "That's a matter of record," Stelner said with a smoothness that had developed a very slight friction. "I know it's a matter of record. I'm asking what services. Maintenance assessment implies services were performed. What services?" Another pause. "I'm not going to engage in a detailed legal discussion on a cold call, Mr. Mercer." "It's not a cold call, Mr. Stelner. You called me." Grant watched the clerk. She was printing something, his request coming through. "But I appreciate the reach out. It's helpful. I'd encourage you to think carefully about the situation you're inserting yourself into. I'd encourage you to make sure your 2019 lien documentation is very detailed," Grant said, "because if it's not, and someone decides to look at both Harrow Pacific and Cascadia Waterfront as connected entities with the same principal management, the maintenance lien looks less like a debt and more like a manufactured instrument. The silence this time was longer. When Stelner spoke again, the smooth was still there, but the calibration had changed. The difference between a man performing confidence and one choosing his words. I see you've done some reading. Morning's young. Mr. Mercer, you're a veteran with a disability check and a month-to-month lease in a building that's been sold to new ownership, effective December 1st. I'd think carefully about what fights are worth picking. Grant felt the information land. The December 1st detail, which was new, which meant they'd been thorough enough to research his housing situation and were now using it explicitly. He sat with the feeling for a moment. Not anger, something cooler than that. December 1st, he said. Good to know. I'll update my calendar. He hung up. The clerk looked up. Mr. Mercer? Your request is ready. He crossed to the counter. She handed him a printed packet, 11 pages, date stamped, the full filing history of the Lake House parcel. He took it without looking at it. He'd look at it with Elena. Thank you, he said. She was already turning back to her monitor. Then she stopped, turned back, spoke quietly, not whispering, but at the volume of someone who has decided to say something small that she couldn't undecide once she started. That parcel, I pulled it. Grant looked at her. We've had 3 separate requests on that parcel number in the last 4 months, she said. 2 from a law firm in Portland. 1 from a county assessor we don't normally see do individual parcel pulls. She held his gaze for a beat. Just so you know. She turned back to her monitor. Grant folded the packet and put it under his arm and walked out. He told Elena on the walk back. All of it. The call from Stelner, the December 1st information, the clerk's observation about the repeat pulls. He laid it out the way he laid everything out, sequentially, without editorializing, letting her process the weight of each piece before adding the next. She walked and listened. Ranger moved between them. The morning had cleared enough to show something like actual sky above the tree line, which in Harbor Ridge in late October felt like a concession from the weather. When he finished, she was quiet for half a block. Then, he threatened your housing. He flagged it, technically a fact about my building's ownership. That's a threat, Grant. Yeah. He knew exactly what to say. He's good at his job. That's what makes him dangerous. Grant shifted the packet under his arm. But he made a mistake. What mistake? He called me at all. Grant glanced at her. You don't call someone to have a reasonable conversation unless you're worried. You file paperwork and you wait. He called because last night accelerated something. Maybe they saw the photographs you took. Maybe they were watching the window. Either way, they know we have materials and they're trying to assess how serious we are before we make a move. Elena processed this. Are we serious? Getting there. They reached the coffee shop. Grant held the door. Ranger went through first, which was a habit so ingrained in the dog that it happened regardless of whether anyone was directing him. The working animal's instinct to move through thresholds first, to take the read of whatever was on the other side before his person did. Inside, they took the corner table. Elena ordered a second coffee she probably didn't need and held the mug with both hands, while Grant spread the 11-page printout on the table. He read it. Elena read alongside him. Ranger lay under the table with his chin on Grant's left foot, which Grant registered as a specific and deliberate placement. The lien was on page 4. Filed October 2019, under Cascadia Waterfront Management Services. Notarized. Citing Oregon Revised Statute 87.010, a valid statute for construction and maintenance liens, which meant someone had been careful enough to use real legal authority. Amount: $14,300. Service rendered: property waterfront maintenance and structural assessment services per contractual agreement dated March 2019. Grant read that phrase 3 times. Do you have any documentation of a contractual agreement between your mother and Cascadia Waterfront from March 2019? He said. Elena looked at the page. No, I've never seen a contract with that name. Did your mother have a property manager? Anyone who helped her with the house in her later years? My cousin helped her with bills sometimes. Naomi. She lives in Salem. Would Naomi have signed anything on her behalf? Maybe. I don't know. Elena frowned. My mother wasn't well by March 2019. She was pretty far along by then. If someone presented a service agreement to a cognitively impaired property owner or to someone acting informally on her behalf without a legal power of attorney and got a signature on it, that agreement is challengeable. Grant put his finger on the lien notation. But it's only challengeable if we can prove the signatory either lacked capacity or lacked legal authority. Naomi would tell me the truth, Elena said. If she signed something, she'd tell me. Can you call her this morning? She already had her phone out. She stepped away from the table toward the window and made the call, and Grant looked at the printout and drank the coffee he'd ordered, mediocre as advertised, and thought about what Stelner had said about December 1st. He hadn't been lying. Grant knew it because after the call he'd spent 30 seconds pulling up the Harbor Ridge Property Records portal on his phone and looking up his own building. The ownership transfer was there, in the preliminary filings. His building had been acquired by a holding company called Pacific North Properties Group, LLC, in August. He'd never been notified because there was no legal obligation to notify month-to-month tenants of a property sale, only of an ownership transfer that affected their tenancy. And that notification window was 60 days, which put it at the beginning of December. He looked at Ranger under the table. The dog looked back at him with the equanimity of an animal that had never wasted energy on problems it couldn't solve yet. Yeah, Grant said quietly. I know. Elena came back to the table. Her expression had changed, not worse, exactly, but sharper. The specific clarity that arrives when a suspicion gets confirmed. Naomi signed something in April 2019, she said. She thought it was a government assessment, something about dock safety codes. A man came to the house. He had documents. He told her it was a routine inspection certification and that signing meant the property was compliant. She sat down. She had no idea it was a private company. Does she still have a copy of what she signed? She's looking. Bob Grant wrote on the margin of the printout, April 2019. Signature obtained by misrepresentation. Service agreement / dock safety pretext. Witness. Naomi. Last name? He looked at Elena. Naomi Reyes, she said, reading the question. He wrote it down. He looked at what he had on the table. The printout. The legal pad. Lucas's drive in Elena's pocket. An eyewitness to a fraudulent signature. A law firm with 2 corporate shells using the same registration infrastructure. A phone call from an attorney who'd been nervous enough to make it, which was itself a data point. The photographs Elena had taken of the SUV. 3 men who'd come to Grant's door and retreated when the math didn't work for them. And an attorney general's property fraud division phone number at the bottom of a text file that a dead soldier had written 4 days before his last deployment. Elena, Grant said. She looked at him. We're ready to move. She held his gaze. Behind her, through the coffee shop window, Harbor Ridge went about its morning. A delivery truck, a woman walking 2 small dogs, a teenager on a bicycle ignoring the light. Normal. Ordinary. The world running its quiet engine around the small, extraordinary collision of events that had been building since a cardboard sign in an alley in the rain. Okay, she said. It's not going to be fast. Legal process isn't fast. I know. And Stelner is going to push back, harder than last night and smarter. I know that too. And I can't promise. Grant. She stopped him. Her voice was even, certain, the voice of someone who has decided something and doesn't need to be talked through it. I know what you can't promise. Just tell me what we're doing first. Grant looked at the table. At the evidence assembled from an old drive and a morning's work, and a clerk who'd said something small and important under fluorescent lights. First, he said, we call the AG's office. Ranger's tail moved once against the floor beneath the table. It wasn't a dramatic sound, just a quiet percussion against linoleum, in a corner booth of a mediocre coffee shop, on an ordinary Tuesday morning in a town that was about to become significantly more complicated for Harrow Pacific Property Group, LLC, and everyone who had decided that Elena Brooks was a person without resources. They had been wrong about that from the beginning. They just hadn't known it until now. The Oregon Attorney General's Property Fraud Division did not pick up on the first call, or the second. On the third attempt, at 9:47 a.m., a woman answered with the clipped efficiency of someone who fielded too many calls and had learned to triage within the first 15 seconds of any conversation. Grant handed the phone to Elena. This was Elena's case. Her name on the property record, her family, her documentation. He could organize it, but he couldn't own it for her. Elena talked for 6 minutes. She was precise, which surprised the woman on the other end enough that the clipped efficiency shifted into something more engaged somewhere around the 2-minute mark. Elena gave the parcel number, the corporate names, the lien filing date, the name of the law firm, and the approximate contents of the USB drive without getting into detail she couldn't verify on the spot. At the end, she said, "My brother documented this before he deployed. He didn't come home. The drive is organized and everything is date-stamped." A pause from the other end. "Can you come in?" the woman said. "When?" "Thursday morning, 9 a.m. Portland office. Ask for investigator Dara Holt." Elena looked at Grant. He nodded once. "We'll be there," Elena said. She hung up. She set the phone on the table and sat with her hands flat on either side of it, and her exhale was the kind that releases something structural rather than just respiratory. Ranger's head came up from under the table and he rested his chin on her knee, and she put one hand on his head without looking down. "Thursday," she said. 2 days, Grant said. "We used them." He meant it literally. They spent the rest of Tuesday organizing Lucas's drive into a printed packet, Grant's laptop, the coffee shop's Wi-Fi, a print shop 2 blocks over that charged 38 cents a page and had a clerk who was mercifully uninterested in what anyone was printing. 41 pages total. Grant organized them chronologically, with a 1-page index in the front that he wrote himself, using the same format he'd used for intelligence summaries: source, date, content, relevance. Clean, cross-referenced. The kind of package that told an investigator within 60 seconds whether the person presenting it knew what they were doing. Elena watched him build it and said, halfway through, "You've done this before." "Not exactly this." "Close enough." He didn't deny it. They worked until early afternoon, then walked back to the apartment. The SUV didn't reappear. No calls from unknown numbers. The silence had the quality of something gathering rather than something finished, and Grant moved through it accordingly. Methodical, unhurried, not mistaking quiet for safety. That evening he taught Elena the first thing he'd taught every green operator he'd ever been assigned to mentor, which was how to be aware of a room without looking like you're being aware of it. How to sit in a public space and know where every exit was, where the visual blind spots were, which people had been there when you arrived and which had arrived after. Not paranoia, calibration. The difference between a person who jumps at shadows and a person who sees the shadow before it moves. She was a fast study. He hadn't expected otherwise. They used the diner 2 blocks from the apartment as the practice space, which had the advantage of being public and the disadvantage of having coffee that made the coffee shop's offering look aspirational. Elena sat with her back to the wall. She'd done that instinctively, which told him something, and ran through the exercise without him prompting her after the first iteration. "Man at the counter has been here since before us," she said, without looking at the counter. "Blue jacket. He's on his 2nd coffee, but he hasn't looked at his phone once, which is unusual. Or he's just tired and doesn't want the screen." "Possible." She was quiet. "He's also facing the window at an angle that gives him a sightline to the door without having to turn his head." Grant drank his coffee. "Good," he said. "Is he one of theirs?" "I don't know, probably not. But you noticed him, which is what matters." She nodded. Then, "Is this what you did? In the teams?" "Part of it." "What was the rest?" He considered how to answer that honestly without the kind of cinematic compression that turned operational reality into something it wasn't. "Mostly planning," he said. "Logistics. Pre-mission analysis. The actual kinetic part lasted minutes, sometimes seconds. Everything before and after was information." "You miss it." It wasn't quite a question. "I miss having a clear problem," he said. "Everything else about it I've mostly made my peace with." She looked at him. Mostly. Yeah. He picked up his cup. Mostly. The man in the blue jacket paid his check and left. The door opened, let in a bar of cold air, and closed. Grant watched him through the window as he walked north on the sidewalk, hands in his pockets, unhurried, and disappeared at the corner. Probably nothing. Most things were. Manchement. Wednesday arrived with actual sun, which felt like a tactical error on the weather's part. Harbor Ridge didn't suit sun in late October. It made the gaps more visible, the storefronts that had been closed 6 months, the peeling paint on the municipal building's eaves, the particular quality of off-season light that showed everything the summer's foot traffic had been covering. Grant got a call at 7:15 a.m. from a number he didn't recognize, but this one had a Portland area code rather than a local one, and when he answered, it was not Stelner. Mr. Mercer, my name is Carl Whitfield. I'm an associate at Stelner and Voigt. Younger voice than Stelner, more careful about its smoothness in the way of someone still learning how to deploy it. Mr. Stelner asked me to follow up. On what? On the conversation you had yesterday morning. He wanted me to communicate that the firm is prepared to offer Ms. Brooks a settlement. Given the complexity of the title situation, Harrow Pacific would be willing to pay a cash settlement of $40,000 in exchange for a clean quitclaim deed transfer of the Lake House parcel. Grant sat with that for a moment. $40,000 for a waterfront lot with private dock access was, by his calculation of current Harbor Ridge property values, approximately 1/5 of the actual market value of the land alone, before any development consideration. Tell Mr. Stelner we appreciate the offer, Grant said. And? And that Ms. Brooks will be in Portland Thursday morning, where she has a prior commitment. He paused. You might want to let him know about that. A brief silence, then, who is that commitment with? Her attorney, Grant said, and hung up. He didn't have an attorney. That was a problem for Wednesday afternoon. He found one. Her name was Patricia Okafor, and she ran a 2-person practice on the second floor of a building on Harbor Ridge's Main Street that shared a floor with a tax preparer and a chiropractor. Her specialty was listed on the door placard as real property and estate law, and the waiting area had 3 chairs and a spider plant and a framed print that someone had chosen with sincerity rather than taste. Grant had seen her name on a flyer at the post office 3 weeks ago for a free legal consultation clinic that she ran on the second Saturday of every month. He'd filed it away without knowing why, the way he filed things. He brought Elena. He brought the 41-page packet. He brought Ranger, who sat in the waiting room with the spider plant while they went in. Patricia Okafor was in her mid-40s, with the particular economy of movement of someone who scheduled her days tightly and had learned to assess new clients within the first 2 minutes of a meeting. She had read the property records for Harbor Ridge County for 15 years. She knew every filing pattern, every common mechanism, every law firm that showed up regularly in the county's real property dockets. She recognized Stelner and Voigt before Grant finished the first page of the packet. She said. Not a full word, a sound that contained professional recognition and personal distaste in roughly equal measure. You know them, Elena said. I know their work. I've seen this structure before, not this specific target, but the mechanism. She turned to page 4, the lien filing. Read it. Turned to the index page Grant had prepared and followed the cross-references with the focused attention of someone whose opinion of the work was forming in real time. This index. Who did this? Grant, Elena said. Patricia looked at him. A brief reappraisal. What did you do before? Navy, mostly intelligence analysis and tactical planning. Useful. She turned another page. The signature issue. Your cousin's testimony about misrepresentation. Has she put it in writing? I asked her to write it out and notarize it, Elena said. She's doing it today. Good. That's your sharpest edge. The lien itself is technically valid. They used the right statute, they filed correctly, they hit the timeline. What breaks it is the predicate. If the service agreement that the lien relies on was obtained through misrepresentation, the lien collapses. She closed the packet. I need to see the actual agreement Naomi signed. Do you have it? She emailed me a photo this morning. Elena had her phone out already. Patricia looked at the photo on the phone screen for 30 seconds. Okay, she said. Then she leaned back in her chair and looked at them both. This is a good case. I want to be honest with you. Good doesn't mean easy, and it doesn't mean fast. We're looking at a minimum of 4 to 6 months to get a lien challenge through the county circuit court, assuming no complications. What counts as complications? Grant said. Stelner filing a counter motion, which he will. The circuit court's docket, which is backed up. Whether they have a sympathetic ear at the county assessor's level, which, based on your drive content, they might. She looked at Elena. But the AG involvement changes the calculus. If Investigator Holt decides this rises to the level of a pattern investigation, the individual case gets much stronger because it's no longer one property owner making an allegation. It's a government agency documenting a systemic practice. They offered a settlement this morning, Grant said. $40,000. Patricia raised an eyebrow. Not shock. Professional calibration. They move fast. They called yesterday, too, after we pulled the county records. They're watching the public access terminal, she said. Property parcel lookups on their flagged listings get tracked. Standard practice for firms running this kind of operation. They want to know when someone starts digging before the person digging knows they're being watched. She looked at Grant. You knew that. That's why you went in person rather than doing the online pull. I went in person because I wanted the date stamp on the printout, Grant said. The watching the terminal part I suspected but didn't know. You suspected right. She picked up her pen. The settlement offer means they've assessed the risk and decided $40,000 is cheaper than a challenge, which means the property is worth significantly more than $40,000 to them. Don't take the offer. We weren't going to, Elena said. Good. She made a note. I'll meet you Thursday morning in Portland, not at the AG's office. There's a coffee place 2 blocks from it. We'll go over the presentation together first. She named the place and the time. She did not say it would be fine. She did not offer assurances that the system would work the way it was supposed to. She just wrote down the time, handed Elena the notepad page, and stood up in the way that people stand up when a meeting has accomplished what it needed to, and the next step is doing the work. Grant respected that more than any reassurance would have been worth. In the parking lot afterward, Elena stopped walking. She stood beside Grant's truck, a 2009 Ford F-150 with a cracked dashboard pad and a heater that worked on the passenger side but not the driver's side, which he'd stopped being annoyed about somewhere around the second winter. And she said, Patricia didn't ask about money. She'll bill us. She didn't ask about a retainer. She probably figured out you don't have one. He opened the passenger door for Ranger, who assessed the seat height, made a decision, and climbed in with the careful dignity of an animal unwilling to ask for help even when it might be warranted. She'll work something out. People like her usually do. People like her. People who got into property law in small Oregon counties. He closed the dog's door. It's not a lucrative specialty. You do it because you care about what happens to property owners in small Oregon counties. Elena looked at him over the roof of the truck. You sized her up fast. Force of habit. She got in. He walked around to the driver's side and settled into the cold seat. The heater was already failing to address his half of the cab, and started the engine. The F-150 turned over with the reliable disgruntlement of a machine that had never been babied and had developed opinions about it. Grant, Elena said. She was looking forward through the windshield. Stelner mentioned your building, the December 1st transfer. Yeah. Is that real? Already checked. It's real. So they're going to evict you. They're going to not renew my month-to-month lease. Different thing legally. Same practical result. She turned to look at him. Because of me. Because you got involved. He pulled out of the parking spot and onto the street. Ranger was sitting in the middle of the bench seat between them, which was technically a safety issue, and practically the only position the dog seemed willing to accept in vehicles. My building's ownership changed in August, Grant said. Before we met, the December timeline was probably already set before I ever saw that alley. He flipped his turn signal. Stelner flagging it to me was a pressure tactic. The thing itself existed before I was relevant to it. You don't know that for certain. No. He stopped at the light. But I know the math on it, and the math says I was probably already on that list. Elena sat with this. The light changed. He drove. "You could still walk away," she said. It wasn't a suggestion. It was something she needed to say, and she was saying it carefully. "I know. Patricia's involved now. The AG's office is aware. You've done what you came to do, functionally." "I know," he said again. So I'm not walking away." He said it the same way he said most things, flat, without drama, in the register of something that had been decided before the conversation started. That's not a rescue thing. It's not a debt thing anymore either. It's... He stopped, tried again. "Your brother left you a map. He built it carefully under conditions where careful was hard, and then he trusted you to use it. That matters to me." He looked at the road. "And Ranger sat with me through a nightmare 4 nights ago, and I slept for the first time in 2 years. That matters to me too. I'm not good at walking away from things that matter." Ranger shifted his weight and pressed his flank against Grant's right arm, which made steering slightly inconvenient and didn't make Grant move him. Elena looked out the passenger window. The town passed by in its late October state, the lake visible at the end of cross streets, flat and gray and enormous, the kind of presence that reminded you that the town existed in relation to something much larger than itself. "I called Naomi back this morning," she said, "before we went to Patricia's. And? She told me the man who came to the house in April 2019, the one who had her sign the agreement." She paused. "He didn't just come once. He came 3 times over 2 months, each time with different paperwork. Naomi signed 2 things she thought were government forms." Grant's hands tightened slightly on the wheel. "2. The assessment lien and something else. She doesn't have a copy of the second thing. She didn't think to photograph it. Do you know what it was? She thinks it was some kind of consent to assess form, or something that sounded like that." Elena turned from the window to look at him. "What would a second document mean?" "Depends what it said. At worst, a second lien instrument, or something they could use to establish a pattern of consent by the property owner." He thought about it. "We need Naomi to write down everything she remembers about both visits, every detail. What he looked like, what he said, exactly how he described each document." "She's in Salem. Can she come Thursday? To Portland afterward?" "I'll ask." Elena pulled out her phone, then stopped, looked at it, put it down. "She's going to feel terrible about this. She's been feeling terrible about it since I called yesterday. She didn't know. Make sure she understands that." Grant glanced at her. She was manipulated by professionals. That's not a personal failure. It's a professional crime. There's a difference, and she needs to hear that. Elena looked at him with the expression she sometimes had when he said things that landed in a way she hadn't anticipated. He'd noticed it 3 times now. He hadn't commented on it. She called Naomi. They were 3 blocks from the apartment when Grant felt it. Not a thought, a sensation. The particular shift in environmental texture that he associated with being observed. Something different about the block. He couldn't have named what precisely. A parked car that hadn't been there this morning. A figure in a doorway who was standing with a specific quality of stillness. He filed it without reacting. He parked. They got out. He didn't look around because looking around was information you were giving, and he preferred to gather rather than give. In the stairwell, he said quietly, "When we get inside, don't turn any lights on immediately." Elena said nothing, which meant she'd understood. They went up. He unlocked the door. They went in and he stood for a moment in the dim apartment while his eyes adjusted, running the room. Everything where it had been. No entry, no disturbance. He went to the window. The car was a gray sedan, registered lines slightly wrong for a civilian vehicle in the way that fleet vehicles have, parked across the street with what appeared to be one occupant. Different from the SUV. Different make, different style. Different, he thought, different organization entirely. He stood at the window for a long moment. Then he went to the kitchen because he needed to think, and he thought best when his hands had something simple to do. He put the kettle on. He found the last of the crackers. He stood at the counter and looked at the wall. After a few minutes, Elena came to stand in the kitchen doorway. Same people? I don't think so. She looked at the window. Then who? Gray Fleet sedan. One occupant, not moving, no food, no phone visible. Not a private investigator. They look at their phones constantly. Not the SUV crew. Different pattern entirely. He picked up his own phone, looked at it, put it down. I need to make a call. To who? He thought about how to answer that, and whether the answer would raise more questions than it settled, and decided that the longer he managed information in ways that were protective rather than honest, the more it would cost him later. I spent 11 years in naval special warfare, he said, most of that in direct action and intelligence roles. When I got out, I had a brief period where I did consulting work for a contractor that worked adjacent to federal agencies. I've been out of that for 3 years. He looked at her. I still have a contact, someone who might be able to tell me if a Gray Fleet sedan parked outside my building on the same day we made an appointment with the AG's office is coincidence or something else. Elena stared at him. You think the AG's office put someone on us? I think it's possible that the AG's office made a call after Elena Brooks contacted them, and that call went somewhere, and someone decided to run a check on Grant Mercer before Thursday. He kept his voice flat. That's not threatening, necessarily. Could be standard due diligence. Could be something else. What else? Depends on how far the Meridian Cascade Holdings money goes. He picked up the phone. Give me 10 minutes. He went to the bedroom, the room that was mostly closet, and the mattress he'd given Elena, currently unmade, and closed the door most of the way and dialed a number that wasn't in his contacts because he'd memorized it 3 years ago and hadn't called it since. It rang 4 times. A voice answered. Male, early 50s, the specific flatness of a man who had spent 25 years in organizations where emotional inflection was a liability. Well, Mercer. Kaysen. Been a while. 3 years. You counting? A pause that wasn't quite unfriendly. What do you need? Background check, Grant said. On me. Run in the last 48 hours by a federal adjacent agency. Would it have generated a notification on your end? Silence. The kind of silence that was working rather than empty. Depends on which registry it hit. Another pause. Give me 20 minutes. I'm at my apartment. I know where you are, Kaysen said, and the line went quiet. Grant sat on the edge of Elena's unmade mattress and looked at his boots and waited. 18 minutes later, his phone buzzed. Department of Justice, Civil Division, Kaysen said, without preamble. Ran a standard background check on you at 10:47 this morning. Triggered because your name appeared in an AG office intake log. A pause. The DOJ, Civil Division, runs these as a matter of course when new informants or witnesses contact the AG on financial crime matters. It's standard. So it's due diligence. Most likely, but... A pause that had weight. Meridian Cascade Holdings has a registered federal lobbying interest. They've retained a DC firm, which means when their name shows up in any state-level investigation intake, there's a notification mechanism. Grant understood this immediately. So DOJ Civil does a background check on the witness, which is standard, but Meridian's lobbying interest means their counsel is notified that the check was run, which flags that a witness made contact. That's probably the chain, yeah. So Stelner could know by end of day that Elena's talked to the AG. Stelner already represents a shell of a shell, Kaysen said. He's not the one with the lobbying connection. Meridian Cascade is. Their principal is a man named Warren Gast. Portland commercial real estate, about $200 million in assets, significant political connections in Oregon and Washington state. Another pause. Mercer. What are you into? Property fraud case, family lake house, 2 corporate shells, and a fraudulent lien. That's what it is on the surface. You know something about Meridian Cascade. It wasn't a question, and Kaysen recognized it as such. A pause that lasted long enough to tell Grant that what was being decided was not whether to say something, but how much of it to say. 3 years ago, Kaysen said finally, there was an informal inquiry at the federal level into a pattern of lakefront property acquisitions along the Oregon and Washington coast. Acquisition mechanism: manufactured liens, fraudulent consent documents, predatory transfer proceedings targeting elderly or bereaved property owners. The inquiry was closed, insufficient evidence for a federal case, and the state-level AGs weren't coordinating. A breath. The inquiry touched several property groups. Meridian Cascade was on the list. Grant sat very still on the mattress. "How many properties?" he said. "In the 3 states where the pattern was documented, somewhere between 30 and 50 over 5 years, most of which resulted in clean title transfers before anyone filed a challenge. 30 to 50 families." He thought about the $10 sign in the rain and what it had taken for Elena to write it. And he thought about the 30 to 50 other people who had not had a drive, had not had a brother who documented things carefully before he deployed, had not had an alley at the right moment with the right person walking through it. "Is the inquiry still on someone's radar?" he said. "Dormant," Kaysen said. "Not closed. Dormant." Another pause. "Oregon AG's Property Fraud Division has been building towards something for about 8 months. Dara Holt specifically. If your case gives her what she's been missing—" "Pattern evidence," Grant said. "Eyewitness account of misrepresentation, corporate structure connecting both entities to a single law firm, a dead service member's documented file." "That'd do it," Kaysen said. "Yeah." They were quiet for a moment, separated by a phone connection and 3 years and a number of things that Kaysen probably knew about Grant's last few years that Grant had never put into words for anyone. "The sedan outside your building," Kaysen said. "That's DOJ standard protocol observation after a federal registry check on an active intake witness. They're not there to stop you. They're there because you're now a data point in something larger than a local property case, and they want to know what you do next." Grant exhaled through his nose. "So they're watching to see if we run. Or if someone runs you off." He looked at the floor, at his boots, at the particular scuff on the left toe that had been there since the deployment he didn't need to think about right now. "Tell me something, Kaysen. The inquiry that was closed, did it document any of the targets by name?" "Some, cross-referenced with property records." "Was Brooks' Sierra Lake property, Harbor Ridge, Oregon, on the list?" A pause. Longer this time. "Yeah," Kaysen said. "It was." Grant pressed his thumb and forefinger to his eyes for a moment. Lucas had found a federal-level pattern. He'd documented it with the same tools he had: property records, corporate filings, a dead soldier's careful attention. And he'd been 8 months from deployment and had done what he could, and then gone where he had to go and hadn't come back. And his dog had sat in the rain for 3 weeks holding a sign for $10, waiting for someone who understood loyalty to walk by. "Kaysen," Grant said. "Yeah." "I need everything the inquiry documented, not classified. The public record accessible portions. Can you point me toward them?" "Oregon Secretary of State's Business Filing Archives. Search Meridian Cascade Holdings cross-referenced with the 2021 to 2022 filing period. The inquiry generated some compelled disclosures that ended up in the public record before the federal case was closed." A pause. "Mercer, this is a real thing you're doing." "I know." "You in a place for a real thing?" Grant looked at the half-open door, through which he could see the main room, Elena sitting at the table with the documents, Ranger beside her chair, both of them waiting without impatience for whatever came next. "Yeah," he said. "I think so." He hung up. He sat on the mattress for a moment longer. He was thinking about Stelner's smooth voice and Warren Gast and 30 to 50 families and an inquiry that had been opened and closed and set on a shelf somewhere. And he was thinking about Lucas Brooks at 23 writing in a logbook margin and at 30 building a file 4 days before he deployed. And he was thinking about what it cost to know something was wrong and not have the specific person in the specific place at the specific time to stop it. Then he got up. He walked back to the main room. Elena looked up, read something in his face. "Tell me," she said. He sat down across from her. He put his hands flat on the table, on either side of Lucas's documents, and he told her everything Kaysen had said, in order, without softening any of it. She listened the way she'd been listening since the beginning, fully, without interrupting. without the kind of visible emotional reaction that would have made the telling easier, but the information harder to absorb. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Ranger put his chin on the table edge, which he wasn't supposed to do, and both of them looked at him, and neither of them said anything about it. 30 to 50 families, Elena said finally. That we know of. And if Thursday goes the way Patricia thinks it might, then it's not just your case anymore. Dara Holt folds yours into the larger pattern, and Meridian Cascade answers for all of it. Elena looked at the documents on the table, at her brother's careful print in the margins, at the index page Grant had made, which began with a parcel number and ended with a law firm's name connected by a line to two corporate shells that had been feeding on grief and absence for years. He would have hated knowing he was one case in 50, she said. He would have hated it, Grant agreed, and he would have gone to Portland on Thursday anyway. She looked at him. Her eyes were dry. Her jaw was set. She looked, Grant thought, like someone who had been carrying a weight so long that they'd forgotten it was unusual to carry it, and had only just realized that they weren't being asked to put it down. They were being asked to use it. Okay, she said, for the second time, in the same voice as the first time, which was the voice of someone who had decided completely and did not need to say it again. Outside, the gray sedan sat. The lake at the end of the street lay flat and still. The sun that had arrived with bad timing that morning had burned through the cloud cover into something genuine, laying amber light across the water and the street and the building's old brick face, making Harbor Ridge look, briefly, like somewhere worth fighting for. Grant looked at the documents. Tomorrow they would find Warren Gas public filings in the state archive. Tomorrow they would organize the full presentation for Patricia. Tomorrow, Naomi Reyes would write down everything she remembered about a man who had come to a dying woman's house 3 times and left with her signature on 2 documents she didn't understand. But that was tomorrow. Right now, Grant got up and put the kettle on again, because it was the thing he did when the next step was clear, and the only remaining question was how many cups it would take to get there. Ranger stood up, stretched with the careful extension of an animal managing old joints, and walked to his spot near the heater. The apartment was quiet in the way that rooms are quiet when the people in them are no longer running from something and have not yet started toward the next thing. Just the kettle building toward a boil. Just 3 damaged things, 2 people and a dog, sitting in the middle of what they'd managed to build in 5 days out of nothing but necessity and the specific kind of trust that doesn't ask to be explained. It wasn't much. It was enough. The kettle was still warm when Grant's phone buzzed with a text from an Oregon Secretary of State search alert he'd set up the night before. He read it standing at the counter. Then he read it again. Meridian Cascade Holdings had filed an amended corporate dissolution notice that afternoon. Not a full dissolution, the legal equivalent of a company quietly backing toward a door while maintaining eye contact, but a restructuring notice that removed Warren Gas' name from the managing member list and replaced it with a numbered holding entity registered in Delaware. The filing timestamp was 3:47 p.m. Wednesday, less than 30 hours after Elena had called the AG's office. They were moving money, repositioning liability, getting Gas' name off the surface of things before Thursday arrived. Grant photographed the alert on his phone, sent it to Patricia Okafor with a 2-line note, and had a response within 4 minutes. Exactly what I expected. Screenshot everything. See you at 8 a.m. He showed Elena the exchange. She read it, looked up. They're scared. They're managing exposure, which means they know what Thursday is. Stelner told them. Someone did. He put the phone down. It doesn't change Thursday. If anything, it helps. Amendment filings are time-stamped public record. It shows responsive behavior to the AG intake, which an investigator reads as consciousness of liability. Elena looked at the screen for another moment. Then she set the phone down and stood up from the table and went to the window and stood there for a while, not looking at the street, looking at the lake. The late afternoon light had gone amber and then orange and was moving toward the particular deep red that happened some October evenings when the cloud cover broke at the right angle, the kind of light that made Harbor Ridge look like someone's memory of it rather than the place itself. Grant let her stand there. Ranger got up from the heater and went to stand beside her. She put her hand on his head, and he leaned into it, and they stood like that for a while with the light coming through the window and the lake beyond it turning colors. After a few minutes, she said, without turning, I haven't been to the house since the funeral. Your mother's? Yeah. I drove out there the week after, parked in the driveway, couldn't go in. She was quiet for a moment. Ranger sat in the passenger seat and looked at the house the whole time, like he was waiting for someone to come out. Grant said nothing. I need to go back, she said. After Thursday. Whatever happens, I need to go back. Okay. She turned from the window. Her face in the amber light was tired and certain in the specific way of someone who has made a decision that was always there waiting and has finally caught up to it. Will you come? He looked at her, at Ranger beside her, at the window and the lake and the light that was already changing. Yeah, he said. I'll come. Sen. Thursday morning arrived cold and clear. The drive to Portland was 90 minutes on a highway that ran along the coast for the first 40 before turning inland, and Grant drove it in the particular focused quiet of someone running operational assessment rather than enjoying scenery. Elena sat in the passenger seat with the 41-page packet on her lap and her hands wrapped around a travel mug of coffee that had been made at 5:30 a.m. because neither of them had slept past 5. Ranger was in the back seat. He had claimed the center position, which gave him a sight line through the windshield between the front seats, and he watched the road with the same patient attention he gave everything. They met Patricia Okafor at the coffee place 2 blocks from the AG building at 8 a.m. sharp. She was already there, already had coffee, already had her copy of the packet annotated in 3 colors of ink. She looked at the Meridian Cascade Amendment filing that Grant showed her, and made the same sound she'd made when she saw Stelner and Voigt's name, the professional distaste sound, and then turned to page 1 of her annotated copy and walked them through the presentation order for the next 40 minutes. She was precise. She had done this before. She told Elena what to say and what not to say. Not because Elena wasn't capable, but because the first 10 minutes with an investigator established the frame for everything that followed, and the frame needed to be family member in possession of documented evidence, not complainant seeking sympathy. Lead with Lucas's folder structure, Patricia said, before you say anything about what happened to your family. The organization of the drive tells Holt something about the quality of the evidence before she sees a single document. She looked at Elena. Can you present it without getting emotional? Elena looked at her steadily. I've been carrying this for 8 months. Patricia held her gaze for a moment. Good, she said, which was the highest compliment her register seemed to offer. Naomi Reyes arrived at 8:40, having driven up from Salem that morning. She was mid-40s, with the look of someone who'd been crying intermittently and had made a decision to stop before she got here. She hugged Elena for a long moment in front of the coffee shop while Ranger sat on the sidewalk with his leash looped around a parking meter post and watched with the dignified patience of an animal that understands human grief timelines and is not going to rush them. Naomi looked at Grant. You're the one helping her. Trying to. She looked at him for another second, doing her own assessment, and then nodded in a way that suggested he'd passed something he hadn't known he was being evaluated for. Lucas would have liked you, she said. He had a thing for people who didn't make a lot of noise about what they were doing. Grant didn't have an answer for that, so he didn't make one. They went in at 9. Dara Holt was not what Grant had constructed from the phone call. He'd expected someone administrative, careful, the kind of bureaucratic seriousness that made government offices feel like waiting rooms for real decisions. What he got was a woman in her late 30s who had the specific physical economy of someone who moved through her day with a purpose-to-motion ratio that didn't waste either. She shook hands with all of them, looked at Ranger with a brief flicker of something that might have been approval, and said, Dog stays or goes? He's a trained MWD, Elena said. He's quiet. Fine, Holt gestured to the conference room. Let's sit. The conference room had a table that seated 8 and a window that faced a parking structure. The walls had 2 framed regulatory prints and nothing else. It was exactly the kind of room where things got decided without any of the decoration that suggested decisions were happening. Elena put the drive on the table. Patricia put the packet on the table. Holt looked at both without touching either and said, Start from the beginning, the actual beginning. When did this start for your family? Elena started from Lucas's call in June 2019, when he'd first mentioned the letters. She told it in order, without editorializing, the way you tell things when you've organized them carefully and then practiced them enough that the organization becomes transparent and only the facts show. She was 17 minutes into it when Holt stopped her for the first time. "The corporate amendment filed yesterday afternoon," Holt said. "You aware of it?" "We documented it last night," Grant said. Holt looked at him. This was the third time she'd looked at him with the specific attention of someone who was running a parallel assessment to the one she was conducting openly. "You are?" "Grant Mercer, I'm—" He paused. There wasn't a clean word for what he was. "I'm helping Ms. Brooks organize and present the material." "What's your background?" "Naval Special Warfare, intelligence analysis, contractor work after separation, federal adjacent. I'm out of all of that now." Holt held his gaze for about 3 seconds. Then she turned back to Elena. "Continue." Elena continued. She walked through the drive, the lien filing, the fraudulent service agreement. When she reached Naomi, she nodded once and Naomi took over. Her account of the 2 visits, the documents she'd signed, the dock safety pretext. Her voice was steady. She'd clearly written it out enough times in the last 2 days that she could say it without the emotion taking the structure out from under it. Holt took notes in a small notebook with a fine-point pen. She didn't use a laptop. Grant noted this as a deliberate practice. Handwritten notes in an investigative interview were harder to FOIA than typed ones, which meant she was experienced enough to manage her paper trail. When Naomi finished, Holt sat back. "The drive," she said. "Can I have my technical team copy it today?" "That's why we brought it," Elena said. Holt stood up, went to the door, said something to someone in the hallway, came back and sat down. "Tell me about Meridian Cascade, specifically what the drive has." Grant walked her through it. Not reading from the packet, he'd internalized the structure over 3 days of working with it, and he moved through the corporate connection, the shared law firm, the Washington state filings, the federal inquiry cross-reference from the SOS archives, in the same order he'd put the index together, watching Holt's notebook fill while he talked. When he finished, she didn't say anything immediately. She looked at her notebook, turned back 2 pages. Forward again. Then, "The federal inquiry you're referencing, how did you access that?" "Public record, compelled disclosures in the SOS archive from the 2021 to 2022 period. I had help identifying which records to look for." "What kind of help?" It wasn't quite a question. Grant met her gaze. "A contact. Someone who knew the inquiry existed and told me where the public record portion lived. I found the documents myself." Holt wrote something. "Name?" "I'd rather not." She looked at him. "The information he gave me was directional, not documentary," Grant said. "Everything I'm showing you I found through public records. His name isn't part of the evidence chain." Another held gaze. This one lasted longer. Then Holt wrote something else and turned the page. 30 to 50 properties in 3 states, she said. "Is that a range you're confident in?" "That's the range the federal inquiry documented before it was closed. The actual number is likely higher if you include cases where transfer was completed before any challenge was filed." "It is higher," Holt said, flatly, without expanding on it. The room absorbed this. Elena's hand had moved to Ranger's head beneath the table, and the dog had pressed up against her leg, and neither of them moved. Patricia spoke for the first time since they'd sat down. "What's the timeline for a formal investigation opening?" "Assuming I can verify the drive contents this afternoon, I can have a case summary to my supervisor by end of week." Holt looked at Elena. "I want to be direct with you. An investigation opening doesn't stop the lien process on its own. We'll need to file for an administrative hold on any active transfer proceedings involving your parcel while the investigation is active. That takes a judge's signature, and it's not guaranteed in the same week we open." "How long?" Grant said. "Best case, 10 days. We've had judges turn them around in 5 when the evidence is clear." She looked at the packet. "This is clear." "And the lien challenge," Patricia said, "runs parallel. You file in county circuit, we file the administrative hold. Both protect the property from different angles." Holt looked at Elena. "You're not going to lose the house before this resolves. I want you to hear that clearly. Not as a promise, because I don't make promises about timelines, but as an assessment based on the evidence you've brought. Elena held Holt's gaze. Okay. Do you have somewhere to stay while this moves forward? Elena glanced at Grant. Something brief and complicated passed through her face. We're working on it. Holt stood up, shook hands, paused at Grant. Mercer, the index page of that packet. That's good work. Thank you. She looked at him one more second. You should think about what you want to do with the skills you still have. She left the room. Patricia gathered her copy of the packet. Naomi was rubbing her eyes with the back of her hand in the corner, not quite managing to be unobtrusive about it. Elena sat for a moment with her hands flat on the table, Ranger's chin on her knee, and looked at the window and the parking structure beyond it. 10 days, she said. Best case, Grant said. But she said it. She said it. Elena looked at him. Her eyes were bright in a way that had nothing to do with tears. Something that was the other thing. The thing that arrives when the worst outcome has been narrowly defined and named, and the space around it suddenly has edges instead of going on forever. Lucas would have hated how long it's taking. Yeah, Grant said, and he'd have been in this room doing exactly what you did. She looked at him. Then she picked up the drive and put it in her jacket pocket and stood up, and Ranger stood up with her, and they walked out. They drove to the lake house that afternoon. It was 40 minutes from Portland on a state highway that wound through timber country before dropping down toward the Coast Range, and then a county road that switched from pavement to gravel for the last 2 miles. Grant's truck navigated the gravel with the stoicism of a vehicle that had made peace with its situation. The house appeared through the trees at the end of a clearing. It was a single-story structure built in the style of the 1970s, low roofline, wide porch, cedar siding that had weathered to a silver gray. The garden along the south fence was overgrown but structurally intact, the bones of what had been planted there still visible in the arrangement of the growth. The dock, 40 meters of private shoreline, exactly as Elena had described, was still standing, the boards darkened by weather, but solid. Grant parked in the gravel drive. They sat in the truck for a moment. Last time I got here, I couldn't go in, Elena said. I know. I might not be able to today either. Okay. She looked at the house, the porch, the screen door that was slightly ajar, the latch never quite right according to her own account. Come with me? He got out. Ranger jumped down from the back seat and immediately moved to the tree line at the edge of the clearing. Not distressed, just reacquainting himself with the space his body remembered. He moved through the long grass along the fence line, with a nose-down intensity, cataloging things invisible to the people watching him. Elena stood at the foot of the porch steps. She stood there for about a minute and a half. Grant stood beside her and said nothing, and let the minute and a half be what it needed to be. Then she went up the steps. The screen door squeaked when she opened it. The main door was locked, and she had a key on her keyring, a key she'd been carrying for 8 months. And she unlocked it, and they went in. The house smelled of closed rooms and old wood and something faintly floral that might have been the ghost of whatever her mother had kept on the windowsills. The furniture was covered with sheets. The kitchen was bare but intact. Someone had turned the water off at the main, which had kept the pipes from a winter's worth of damage. Elena walked through the rooms the way people walk through the houses of people they've lost, not looking for anything specific, just re-inhabiting the space with their body, remapping it against the version they'd been carrying in memory. She pulled the sheet off the couch in the living room. She ran her hand along the kitchen counter. She went to the window that faced the lake and stood there while the afternoon light came through it and lay across the floor in pale rectangles. Grant stayed in the doorway and let her have the room. Ranger came in through the back door, which Elena had propped open, and went directly to a specific spot near the baseboard heater in the corner of the living room. He circled once and lay down in exactly the posture of an animal that had done this before, in this spot, many times. His chin went to his forepaws and his eyes half closed. Elena watched him. That was his spot, she said. Grant looked at the dog, at the corner, at the years of living that had worn a faint mark in the linoleum where an animal had lain enough times to leave an impression. He knew, Elena said, quietly. Not surprised exactly, just certain. He's been here before? Lucas used to bring him on leave, before he deployed the last time. She turned from the window. Her face was open in a way that it hadn't been before they'd walked through the door, as if the house had taken some exterior layer off. He loved this place. Grant looked at the room. The sheeted furniture, the afternoon light, the lake visible through the window, the dock's weathered boards visible at the water's edge. It was not a grand house. It was the specific kind of modest that becomes significant only through the accumulation of what happens inside it. The handprints in the concrete out back, the latch that never quite worked, the corner where a dog lay in the same spot across different years and different losses. "I want to fix the porch steps," Grant said. He wasn't sure where the sentence came from. It arrived complete. Elena looked at him. "What?" "The second step. It's soft. You can hear it." He'd heard it on the way up. "I can do it this weekend if you have lumber money." She stared at him. Then something shifted in her face that he wasn't going to try to read precisely, because some things didn't need to be named to be real. "You're not going to say anything about where you're going to sleep?" she said. "You're building, December 1st. That's 6 weeks from now." "Grant." "Elena." He held her gaze. "One problem at a time. That's always been the only way it works." She looked at him for a long moment, then at the room, then at Ranger in his corner, who had the eyes-closed patience of an animal that had already made its assessment of the situation and had no concerns about how it would resolve. "There's a second bedroom," she said finally. "It's full of my mother's things. I haven't—" She paused. "I haven't gone through it yet. There's no rush. It might take a while." "I know." She nodded once, the way she nodded things. Complete, decided. The legal process moved at its own pace, which was not fast, because it was never fast, and Patricia Okafor had been honest about that from the beginning. Dara Holt's supervisor signed off on the investigation opening on Friday afternoon. The administrative hold request went to a circuit judge on Monday and came back signed on Wednesday. 8 days, not 10, which Patricia noted without celebration, but with the specific satisfaction of someone whose assessment of the evidence had been validated. Stelner filed a countermotion. Patricia expected it and had her response prepared before it arrived. She filed it the same afternoon. Warren Gass' name was formally tied to the investigation when Holt's team found his signature on 3 of the original Meridian Cascade Formation documents in the Delaware Registry, which the Delaware Amendment filing had failed to fully obscure. His attorney issued a statement through a different firm. Stelner had withdrawn representation, which was a data point in itself, saying that Mr. Gast was cooperating with investigators and had no direct knowledge of the specific property acquisition practices being examined. Cooperating, Patricia told them over the phone, meant he was already trying to make a deal, which meant he believed the evidence was sufficient and he was calculating what he could trade to reduce his exposure, which meant the evidence was sufficient. The lien challenge worked its way through the county circuit court over the following weeks. It was not dramatic. It was paperwork and hearings and scheduling conflicts and one continuance that pushed a deadline by 3 weeks, and that Grant spent not being frustrated about it, mostly because frustration was not a useful operational state and the outcome didn't change. Naomi Reyes's notarized statement about the fraudulent service agreement was the sharpest edge Patricia had said it would be. The circuit judge reviewing the challenge noted in her preliminary assessment that an agreement obtained through deliberate misrepresentation of its nature to a signatory acting without legal authority for a principal with diminished capacity had no standing as a predicate for a valid lien. The language was careful and judicial and meant the lien was built on something that wasn't real, and therefore the lien wasn't real either. The formal ruling came on a Tuesday in late November. Patricia called at 2:14 p.m. and said 4 words, "The lien is void." Elena was standing in the lake house kitchen when she got the call. She'd been cleaning it, actually cleaning it, not the preliminary touching of surfaces that she'd done the first day, but the real work of bringing a room back to functional. She had rubber gloves on and a bucket of soapy water, and she'd been working in silence for 2 hours while Ranger watched from his corner. She listened to Patricia, said, "Thank you," hung up. She pulled the rubber gloves off, set them on the counter, stood there for a moment. Grant was outside, fixing the porch. He'd done the second step the first weekend and then found that the third was also soft, and the south railing had a post that had rotted at the base, and the work had expanded the way work does when you look at things honestly. He was on his knees with a pry bar when the screen door opened. Elena came out. She stood on the porch and looked at him and said, "It's done." He sat back on his heels. His hands were dirty, and his left knee was complaining about the cold concrete in the way it had been complaining about cold concrete since Helmand Province 9 years ago. He looked up at her. Done? Lien is void. Patricia says the counter motion is effectively moot without the lien to support it. He set the pry bar down. They looked at each other across the porch in the November afternoon. Behind Elena, through the screen door, he could see Ranger's corner. The lake was visible through the trees, flat and gray and permanent. "Lucas did this," Elena said. "He built the case before he left. We just carried it." "You carried it," Grant said. "For 8 months alone, you carried it." She looked at the lake. Something in her face that was not quite crying and not quite not. "I need to put a sign up at the end of the drive so people can find it." He looked at her. "A sign. We talked about, I told you, what I wanted to do with the place." She glanced back at him. "Veterans. Families who need somewhere. A place to come." She said it the way people say things that have been in them a long time and are finally finding the right conditions to come out. Lucas used to say the worst part wasn't the combat. It was coming home to nothing. No decompression space. Nowhere to be between what it was and what it's supposed to be. She looked at the porch railing that Grant had been working on. "This is that place. It already was. We just need to—" "Open the door," Grant said. "Yeah." He picked up the pry bar, looked at the rotten post. "I'm going to need more lumber." She made the sound that might have been a laugh in some context and was something adjacent to it in this one. "I know." Month. The sign went up in December. Elena had painted it herself. Not a professional job, not perfectly level, the letters slightly uneven in the way of things made by hand under imperfect conditions. It read, "Brooks Landing, open to those who need it." Beneath it, smaller, in memory of Lucas Brooks, U.S. Army. Grant had helped her get it into the ground at the end of the gravel drive on a Saturday morning when the first real cold of the season had come in off the coast. His hands were numb by the time the post was set. Ranger supervised from approximately 4 feet away with the critical attention of an animal with strong opinions about structural integrity. "It's crooked," Elena said. Grant looked at it. It was slightly crooked, by about 2 degrees. "Should we redo it?" He considered. The sign was hand-painted cedar with imperfect letters and a slightly unlevel post, and it had been made by a woman who had carried her dead brother's work through 8 months of loss and exhaustion and had come out the other side with her family's land intact and a plan that was larger than what she'd lost. "No," he said. "Leave it." She looked at the sign, then at him. "You're staying." It wasn't a question this time. It had stopped being a question somewhere around the 3rd weekend, when he'd started fixing things beyond the porch, and hadn't said anything about his apartment, and she hadn't asked, and the month-to-month lease on the Birchwood Lane apartment had run its course without ceremony. "Yeah," he said. "I'm staying." She nodded. Looked at the sign once more. Looked at the lake visible beyond the clearing, the water gray and still in the December light. He would have been annoyed that he missed it. He would have been annoyed about everything we did wrong and then made it work better. "Yeah." A sound that was fully a laugh this time. Small, but real. Yeah, he would have. Ranger had moved to the signpost and was conducting an inspection of its base with his nose, his limp slightly more pronounced in the cold, but his attention no less focused. He completed his investigation, seemed satisfied with the findings, and turned back toward the house with the deliberate economy of an animal who had made his assessment and was ready for the next thing. They followed him up the gravel drive. The house was warm inside. Elena had gotten the heater working properly the previous week, and there was wood stacked on the porch now, and the kitchen had food in it, and the second bedroom was half cleared. A slow process, 1 box at a time, The kind of work that couldn't be hurried and didn't need to be. Grant poured 2 cups of coffee, set one in front of Elena at the table, sat down across from her. Outside, the lake turned the particular color it turned on December afternoons when the light came in low across the water and made everything amber and still. Harbor Ridge in winter was a quiet town. The tourists were gone. The waterfront settled into its actual self. The working-class neighborhood it had always been under the seasonal surface. People who had lived here long enough to know the lake in every weather and didn't need it to be beautiful to belong to it. Ranger walked to his corner, circled once, lay down with his chin on his forepaws and his eyes open just enough to watch the room, the way he always watched. Not vigilant exactly, but present. The specific attention of something that has found its place and intends to keep it. Grant looked at him. He thought about the alley in the rain, the $10 sign, the exact quality of stillness a trained dog has when it makes a decision about a stranger and decides they're worth trusting. He thought about how the whole of it had turned on that, not on any particular skill or plan or connection, but on the specific fact of stopping when he could have kept walking. He thought about Lucas Brooks at 22 in a photograph, completely unguarded, and at 30 building a folder structure 4 days before deployment, and about what it cost to leave the people you loved with incomplete information and the hope that they'd figure out the rest. He thought about the 30 to 50 families that Holt's investigation was now building toward. People who hadn't had a drive, hadn't had someone stop in an alley, who had signed papers and received letters, and lost things that couldn't be gotten back. He thought about December 1st, which had come and gone, and the Birchwood Lane apartment that was someone else's problem now. He thought about the porch step he'd fixed, and the railing post, and the rotten board on the dock he was planning to address before the real cold set in. He thought about what Holt had said at the door of the conference room, which he hadn't stopped thinking about entirely since she said it. You should think about what you want to do with the skills you still have. He picked up his coffee. Elena was looking at the window, at the lake, at something beyond it that had to do with everything the last 6 weeks had been and what came next. Patricia called this morning, she said, before you got up. What did she say? Holt's investigation has 3 additional property owners who've come forward, in the county, people who got the same letters, signed the same documents. She held her mug with both hands. She wants to know if I'd be willing to be a primary witness when it goes to formal proceedings. What did you tell her? I said yes. She looked at him. I said yes before she finished asking. He nodded. I'm going to need help, she said. With the legal stuff, the documentation, understanding what they're asking. She paused. Patricia's good, but she doesn't speak military. Some of these other property owners are veterans or veteran families. Lucas's drive, the way it's organized, it matters that someone who understands that structure is there to explain it. Grant looked at his coffee. He understood what she was asking without it being asked directly, and he understood that it was not a small thing, not a weekend project or a porch repair, but the kind of thing that had a shape to it, a direction, a reason to get up in the morning that was larger than survival. He understood what Holt had said at the door. Okay, he said. Elena looked at him. Okay. Yeah. She exhaled, quiet and long, set her mug down, and for a moment they were just 2 people at a kitchen table with coffee going cold and a lake outside the window and a dog sleeping in the corner and no particular thing left to decide except how to start. It was enough. It was, Grant thought, more than enough. Ranger's tail moved twice against the floor, soft percussion in the quiet room, and outside the lake held its color in the fading afternoon light, and the sign at the end of the drive stood slightly crooked in the ground, and the world, the specific small world of Brooks Landing, of Harbor Ridge, of what 3 damaged people had built from what was left, continued doing the thing that things do when the people in them finally stop waiting and start choosing. It continued,